Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Mark, and though I never imagined I'd be telling anyone this story, I feel it's the only thing I can do now. If only I could convince myself that what I experienced a year ago was just a nightmare, but it's not. It's real, and no matter how much I want to forget it, the memory of those days continues to haunt me, stalking me like a shadow that refuses to fade. The trip that led us to that campsite was an idea that came up one random afternoon when the stress of daily life forced us to do something different. We were a group of lifelong friends. Peter, a quiet and methodical guy; Sophie, the most adventurous of us all; Jake, who always had a smile on his face; and me, who simply wanted to disconnect from everything for a few days. The plan was simple: a weekend at an isolated campsite in the forests around Mount Hood, Oregon. None of us had been there before, but we were all drawn to the idea of being away from civilization, from social media, from phones, from everything. Just us, nature, and the glow of a campfire. We left the city in the morning loaded with camping gear, some food, and a few stories to share around the fire. The drive was long, but nothing out of the ordinary. When we arrived at the campsite, a small refuge away from the main roads, we were surprised by the calm that reigned in the place. Only the singing of birds and the sound of wind moving through the leaves broke the silence. The first night was perfect. We lit the campfire, cooked some grilled meat, and began telling stories, those typical stories you always tell in these places. We laughed, remembered school anecdotes, made fun of how ridiculous we were as kids. The moon was full, the sky clear, and the stars seemed closer than ever. Nothing could have made us think that things would take such a strange turn. On the second day, things began to change. Nobody noticed at first, but something wasn't right. In the morning, after a light breakfast, we decided to take a hike around the area. Sophie, as always, was the most enthusiastic and suggested exploring a nearby trail that, according to an old map we found in the refuge, led to a scenic overlook. However, as we walked, something seemed off. The air was denser than usual, and although it was warm, a kind of tension could be felt in every corner of the forest. At first, we ignored it, attributing it to the excitement of camping. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, I began to feel uncomfortable with the sensation of being watched. Every time I turned around, it seemed like the shadows between the trees were moving, as if something or someone was there. But when I looked more closely, there was nothing. Jake, the most carefree of us all, joked that it was the typical paranoia of being away from home, but I couldn't shake that feeling. My eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of movement, but everything remained silent. That night around the fire, the atmosphere changed. The air became colder, and the crackling of branches in the forest was more frequent. Peter, who was normally the calmest, mentioned quietly that he felt like someone was watching us. At first everyone laughed, but I saw his serious face, something that wasn't common for him. Somehow, his words echoed in my mind, and my discomfort grew. I looked toward the trees near the campsite, but everything was dark. Only shadows could be seen stretching and twisting in the firelight. The third night was when things got out of control. We had finished dinner, and everyone settled into the tents to rest. There was a stillness in the air that seemed to foretell something. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. Something was rustling in the bushes, something heavy. I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer or wild boar that had decided to approach the campsite for some reason. But the sound wasn't that of an animal. It was more like someone walking slowly through the shadows, as if they didn't want to be seen, but were very close to us. I got up from the tent cautiously, looking for the others, but seeing the other tents, I realized everyone was still asleep. I tried not to make noise, but my heart was beating hard. I approached the edge of the campsite, looking carefully toward where the sound was coming from. Everything was dark, and I couldn't see anything beyond the shadows. It was then that something moved, something large between the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but I was sure it wasn't an animal. I returned to my tent, waking Peter, who was as confused as I was. We decided to go out together and do a quick check of the campsite, but we found nothing. No footprints, no traces, no signs that anyone had been there. Although I felt something was stalking us, I couldn't prove anything. Everything remained the same, a deep, dark forest, so silent you could hear your own heartbeat. The next morning we decided to talk about what had happened, but what occurred afterward was even more bewildering. When we checked our campsite, we realized that several of our things were out of place. The fire had gone out, and our backpacks, which we had carefully left next to the tents, were moved as if someone had rummaged through them. Nobody had gone to look for anything. We were all together in the tents, but something had taken one of the flashlights and some of our food supplies. That day, we tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the tension was palpable. When we walked deeper into the forest, the feeling of being watched increased with each step. Sophie and Jake tried to downplay it, but Peter and I knew something wasn't right. Every noise, every crack of branches made us turn around. Everything was still, but the air was thick, as if someone was waiting for us to make a mistake. That night was even worse. At 3 a.m, we were awakened by a loud noise near the campsite, a sound like heavy footsteps. This time we all got up, but we still couldn't find anyone. We gathered our courage, went out with flashlights, and walked through the forest. But all we discovered were tracks we didn't recognize. They were large tracks like those of an animal, but much deeper, as if someone had left them intentionally, as if they were watching from very close by. Fear began to consume us, but at the same time, it drove us to find some explanation. The next day we decided it would be better to return to the city, that this wasn't a safe area. When packing everything up, nerves prevented us from thinking clearly. And that's when we noticed that the map we had found in the refuge was no longer there. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had left the tent before that morning's hike. But the map, that seemingly harmless, insignificant detail, was gone. Finally, when we reached the car, a feeling of relief washed over us. We left as quickly as possible, without looking back. Since that day, none of us has spoken about what happened during those days at the campsite. We know something was stalking us, that someone or something was watching us from the beginning. But the worst part is that we never found out who or what it was. We only knew that something in the forest was waiting for us, and we never got to see its face. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I hear those same crackling branches and feel like I'm still being watched. even though I'm in the safety of my home. I don't know if that presence is still out there waiting for us to return, but what I know for certain is that after what we experienced, I'll never camp in an isolated place again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Lewis. I'm 24 years old, and since I was a child, I've always been drawn to the idea of being alone in the middle of nature. Almost my entire life I've lived surrounded by people in the city, where buildings and lights never stop flickering. But despite that, I always knew my place was in the quieter corners of the world, where the noise of traffic couldn't reach, where the air was clean, and the only sound was the whisper of trees. I decided to go camping alone in the mountains, near a small town in northern Colorado, a remote place that few people dared to visit. It's not that I felt especially brave, but I liked the idea of disconnecting from the world, of being with myself. I planned everything carefully. I brought a tent, canned food, water, and of course, a backpack with everything necessary for a peaceful journey. The mountains seemed tranquil and welcoming, as I had always imagined. The first day passed without any trouble. The trail was easy to follow, the sun shone high, and the peace I felt was soothing. As I advanced, the mountains rose around me like sleeping giants, and the wind played with the tree leaves. Upon reaching the campsite, I set up my tent near a stream surrounded by rocks and tall pines. The silence was deep, almost perfect. As I expected, everything was calm. However, that night, when darkness began to envelop me, I felt something strange. It wasn't fear, but a kind of discomfort I couldn't clearly identify. I had camped before, and the silence of nature wasn't new to me, but this time it was different. It was heavier, denser, as if something was waiting. Still, I convinced myself that everything was a product of my mind, that solitude was beginning to make me see things where there were none. I lay down, exhausted from the hike, but soon I began to hear noises. At first, I thought they were nocturnal animals, the crackling of branches, the whisper of wind through the pines. However, when the sound repeated, I realized it wasn't natural. It was soft steps, but clearly audible, as if someone was walking around my campsite. I thought maybe another hiker had gotten lost, and I headed toward the entrance of my tent, but I saw nothing, not a shadow, not a figure. The silence returned, but this time it was different, much heavier. I felt pressure on my chest, a sensation that something was watching from the shadows, as if waiting for something. I closed my eyes trying to calm myself, but the feeling didn't disappear. It was then that from the back of the campsite, I heard something more, a whisper. At first, I couldn't distinguish what it was saying, but as my heart beat faster, the words became clear. "You're not alone here." Terror took hold of me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just lay there motionless, waiting for that sensation to fade. Minutes passed, maybe hours, before I dared to leave the tent again. When I did, the darkness was even denser, and the trees seemed to be much closer than I remembered. I looked around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The campsite was just as I had left it. However, something didn't fit. My things, which I had placed in an orderly way during the day, were now disorganized. My backpack, which I had left near the entrance, was open. and some of the food cans I had brought were outside, as if someone had been going through them. I felt invaded, as if someone had been manipulating my campsite while I slept. I closed the backpack, went back into the tent, and made sure everything was under control. The silence that reigned was so dense I felt like I was suffocating. I was tired, wanted to sleep, but couldn't. In every corner of the darkness, in every shadow that rose against the dim light of my flashlight, I felt something wasn't right. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that everything had been a product of my imagination. The sun shone brightly, and the fresh mountain air seemed to clear any trace of tension. However, while preparing breakfast, something made me look toward the edge of the campsite. There, on a stone, I saw a footprint. It wasn't an animal's footprint, but a human footprint, small, barely visible, but clearly human. Fear hit me again. I wasn't alone. During the day, I decided to take a longer hike to clear my mind. I walked for hours, venturing deeper and deeper into the mountain, looking for answers. But while I did, the thought that tormented me wouldn't leave me in peace. Who was manipulating my campsite? Who was playing with me? When I returned to the campsite, the feeling that something wasn't right intensified. The tent was intact, but everything I had left outside, like my backpack and water bottle, had been moved again. The water bottle was empty, and I couldn't remember drinking so much as to leave it like that. That's when I noticed something much stranger. The rope with which I had tied the tent was completely unraveled, as if someone had touched it, pulled on it, and left everything as it was. It was clear it hadn't been an animal. Someone or something had been there watching me, playing with my campsite, moving my things, leaving me deliberate clues as if trying to make me notice. But why? What did they want from me? That night, I decided to take action. I would set traps, leave signals to see if I could catch whoever was behind all this. However, in doing this, I realized something I had never noticed before. The trees, the way they were arranged, the trails I had walked on, everything seemed to have subtly changed since my arrival. It wasn't much, just small differences. But when I saw it, I knew something wasn't right. Night returned, and this time I was determined to face whatever was lurking in the darkness. I sat by the campfire, the only light that broke the darkness of the campsite, with the flashlight turned off. I listened to the silence first, and then the same sound I had heard on the first night. Footsteps. This time, however, they weren't soft. They were firm, determined, and approaching. My hands began to tremble. The sound didn't come from one side but seemed to surround me, coming from all corners of the campsite. I looked around but saw nothing, only shadows. Seconds passed, maybe minutes, before a whisper reached my ears again. "We knew you would come," said the voice, clear and cold, as if someone was right behind me. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew I wasn't alone. The ground beneath me creaked as if someone was slowly approaching. And just when I felt the air becoming denser, something moved in the darkness. A flash of light, like a flashlight, appeared between the trees, and a shadow slid through the campsite. Instantly, the whisper turned into laughter. Laughter that resonated in the air like echoes, enveloping me completely. I couldn't stay there another second. I grabbed the first thing I could, and in a desperate burst, I ran. I ran aimlessly, not knowing where I was going, just feeling that the mountain, the same one I had chosen to find peace, was now trapping me in its web, in a game I didn't understand. And as I ran, I could hear very close those same footsteps, that same laughter, following me in the darkness. My name is Thomas, and I'm the type of person who enjoys solitude. After a couple of years living in the city, feeling trapped by constant noise and daily worries, I decided I needed an escape. The destination was Glacier National Park in Montana, a place I had heard about so many times in conversations, but had never had the opportunity to visit. My plan was simple: go camping, set up my tent, and spend a few nights in contact with nature, away from phones, responsibilities, and stress. The first day was perfect. The weather was cool, but not too cold, and the sun filtered through the trees, creating shadows that danced on the ground as I walked the trails. The silence was absolute, interrupted only by birdsong and the occasional crackling of branches under my boots. I arrived at the campsite in the afternoon, a small refuge in a secluded area surrounded by pine trees. There were no other people around, which gave me a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. I set up my tent calmly and prepared some food outdoors. Everything seemed to be going perfectly until darkness began to cover the sky and the stars started to shine. I settled into my tent, surrounded by absolute silence, and fell into a deep sleep. Something I now know was a mistake. I woke up at midnight, startled by a noise I couldn't identify. It was like something was dragging across the ground, maybe a twig breaking or a nocturnal animal, but the sound seemed too close. I remained motionless, my heart beating rapidly, trying to listen for any indication of what might be happening outside. However, everything was in complete silence again. Finally, I relaxed, but sleep was no longer the same. I kept tossing and turning in the tent, watching the shadows that my flashlight cast against the walls, wondering if I was really alone. The next morning, while gathering my things to go out and explore a bit more, I noticed something strange. My tent was completely in order, or at least it seemed to be. But something wasn't right. There was something on the ground near my sleeping bag that I didn't remember seeing before. A compass. It wasn't broken, but it was old, much older than I had imagined. The needle was pointing east, though for some reason it didn't seem to move, as if it were stuck. I picked it up cautiously, thinking maybe another camper had lost it, but then I noticed something even stranger. Next to the compass was a small piece of crumpled paper. I unfolded it nervously. The ink was fresh enough to know it hadn't been written days ago. But the letters were disorganized, almost chaotic. It said, "Don't follow the trail. They are near. You have to leave now." At first, I thought someone had left a prank or a message to scare novices. But as the text settled in my mind, a chill ran through my body. Who would have left that in my tent? Nobody had seen me arrive. There were no other campers nearby, or at least not in the immediate surroundings. I felt uneasy, as if something in the air had changed. Suddenly I looked around, and everything was still the same. The trees, the lonely path, the sun shining high in the sky. But inside me, something didn't fit. I stored the compass in my backpack, trying not to give too much importance to the message. I decided to go for a walk and clear my mind, thinking it was just a strange message, a coincidence. But as I walked along the trail, my mind kept circling back to the matter. The feeling that someone or something was watching me wouldn't leave me. During the following hours, I walked through the area looking for some clue that would help me understand what was happening. However, I found nothing that made me feel safer. The sensation that someone else was in the area persisted, and every crack of a branch, every shadow between the trees made me turn quickly, expecting to see someone appear from among the bushes or rocks. But there was nobody. I returned to the campsite at the end of the day, hoping the sunlight would give me some calm. When I arrived at my tent, something stopped me cold. The entrance was open, and I was sure I had closed it before leaving. I approached cautiously, and when I looked inside, I noticed something even more disturbing. The compass was on the ground, in the center of my sleeping bag, with the needle pointing west. It was clearly broken, its needle spinning in circles as if something had manipulated it. My stomach churned. Who had entered my tent while I wasn't there? My mind began to form desperate theories. Maybe someone else was camping nearby. Maybe I was too scared by the message and by the silence of the area. But the truth was I couldn't find a logical explanation. The only possibility was that someone had been there. But there were no evident signs of that. That night fear took hold of me. I decided I wouldn't sleep. I was completely alert, listening to every noise in the darkness. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that had happened, but something told me I shouldn't leave in the middle of the night. It could be a trap. And if someone was waiting for me outside, waiting for me to move away from the safety of the campsite. Suddenly, the sound of soft footsteps, as if someone was walking nearby, made me jump from my position. My heart beat hard, and I tried to look through the cracks in the tent. I saw nothing, but I felt the presence of something, of someone very close. Finally, I made a decision. I had to leave, had to find answers, or at least make sure I wasn't completely alone. I took my flashlight, my backpack, and before leaving the tent, I made sure to close the entrance behind me. I walked for hours, guided only by the light of my flashlight. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly, and the feeling of being followed grew in my chest. I couldn't shake the idea that someone was watching me. The wind blew hard, and the shadows of the trees seemed to move even when there was nothing in motion. It was then that I saw something that froze my blood. At the end of the trail, under a rock, there was a figure. It was facing away with a backpack on its shoulders. I couldn't make out its face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. I stood still, paralyzed by fear, but the figure didn't move. It was completely static, as if waiting for me. I approached, but as I did, something strange happened. The figure disappeared, fading among the shadows of the trees. There was no sound at all, it simply ceased to exist. I turned around, completely terrified, and ran without looking back to my campsite. When I arrived, I felt a strange calm, but at the same time, I knew something had changed. Who or what was there with me? Was it a person, or was it simply my mind playing tricks? That night, as I curled up in my sleeping bag, I tried to convince myself that I was simply scared by the isolation. But I knew something wasn't right. The message, the broken compass, the figure on the trail, I couldn't explain it all. I don't know if I was really alone in the park, or if something much stranger was stalking me. But I could never shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting, lurking in the darkness. My name is Joaquin, and I've always been a family man. For years, my life has revolved around my son Louis, who is 12 years old and is a boy full of curiosity and energy. I often try to take him out of the daily routine, showing him things I would have liked to see when I was his age. One of those adventures I always wanted to do was a trip to the forest. I had always been attracted to the idea of camping in the depths of the mountains, in a remote place, away from everything. So when summer approached, I decided it was the perfect time to take Lewis on a camping trip to a remote area of the Cascade Mountains in Washington. I had talked to him about how incredible it was to be in nature, surrounded by trees, animals, and mountains. What I didn't know was that this experience would change our lives. The trip began like any other. We loaded our backpacks, took the necessary equipment, and headed to the campsite base where other families were meeting. The group consisted of a couple of men with their children, a mother with her young daughter, and two other men who seemed to be lifelong friends, Peter and Jake. They had organized several trips in the past, so I trusted their experience. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, and the idea of being surrounded by vast nature made me feel at peace. The first day we established our campsite near a creek that crossed the forest. The water flowed calm and clear, and the sound of the river relaxed me. Lewis, as always, was full of energy and enthusiasm. He ran off to explore while I set up the tent with the others. As the afternoon progressed, we lit a campfire and sat down to chat under the stars. Everything seemed perfect, nothing could go wrong. However, the next day I noticed something strange. Early in the morning, while the sun was barely rising, I was awakened by a noise in the campsite. I thought it was Lewis, but when I left the tent, I found Peter, who seemed quite uneasy. "Everything okay?" I asked, seeing that his face didn't reflect the relaxed spirit of the previous night. "I don't know," he said in a grave tone. "It seems like Jake and the kids aren't in their tent. I didn't notice yesterday, but now that you mention it, they're not near the river either. I don't want to worry anyone, but something's not right." I decided to go with him to investigate. We headed toward Jake's campsite, which was a few meters from ours. His tent was empty, the backpack still inside, but the space was tidy, as if they had left at some point early before the sun rose. The footprints in the dirt didn't show anything peculiar, but something in my stomach told me this wasn't normal. We returned to the group and told them what we had found. Some of the younger ones, including Lewis, didn't seem worried, but I could see the concern on the faces of the other adults. We decided to organize a small search of the area. At first, we thought maybe Jake and the others had wandered off to explore as we had done the day before. But as the morning progressed and we found no trace of them, worry transformed into something closer to fear. Several hours passed, and we began to lose hope of finding them. We were in the middle of a fairly dense area, surrounded by tall trees and an unsettling silence. Lewis showed concern, but I tried to stay calm, saying everything would be fine, that they had just gone ahead. But the truth was I was beginning to doubt. Something didn't add up. The next discovery was what froze my blood. On a nearby slope, we found a trail of scattered objects, as if someone had been running or had hurried to leave. First, we found a backpack thrown down, then some boots, and finally one of Jake's jackets. It was torn and covered with dirt. But the strangest thing was that there were no signs of struggle or disorderly movement, as if it had been left there without haste. At the bottom, near some bushes, we found something even more puzzling. A piece of cut rope, as if something had torn it. This made me think of a struggle, of something that had happened there. "This doesn't make sense," I said, looking at Peter, who seemed equally confused. "No, it doesn't," he replied with a trembling voice. But there's something else. Look, there are footprints here that I don't recognize. We approached cautiously, and in the dirt, where light barely managed to filter through, we saw large, deep, and wide footprints. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. They seemed to be from something much larger than anything we could have seen in that area. Fear began to take hold of me, and I couldn't stop thinking about the feeling of being watched. We returned to the campsite with the news, but the footprints and the disappearance of our companions didn't seem to be enough to alarm the group. Some thought Jake and the others had had some accident or gotten lost, but they couldn't explain the strange footprints. Others, less inclined to believe in superstitions, continued to think there was a logical explanation, although they couldn't say what it was. The next night, after dinner, we settled around the fire. As the sun set, the darkness in the forest became thicker and the silence became denser. It was then that I heard it, a soft crackling, as if something was moving through the nearby trees. It wasn't wind or a small animal, it was something bigger. Lewis snuggled next to me, also noticing the change in the atmosphere. The worst came when suddenly someone screamed. It was Maria, the mother of the young girl. She came running out of her tent with wide eyes. "Something's in the campsite, something's stalking us," she screamed. We all ran toward her tent, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. However, as we approached the edge of the campsite, we found something we couldn't explain. The footprints, those same footprints we had seen before, were much closer, crossing our campsite, as if something had left them there in the last few hours. Terrified, we tried to organize a watch. We took turns during the night, but nobody slept peacefully. The sound of breaking branches in the darkness and distant whispers kept us on the edge of desperation. Lewis, hugged against me, asked me to leave that place, but I knew I couldn't leave without knowing what had happened. At dawn, I decided to make a decision. We weren't going to keep searching without more clues. If we didn't find the others, we would have to return to town and alert the authorities, although I knew the police wouldn't arrive in time. When we reached the edge of the forest, where the road became visible, we realized that something even more puzzling had occurred. The return path seemed to have lengthened. We walked for hours, and the campsite was less than an hour away, but the mountains seemed infinite to us. Little by little, we moved away from the memories of that place, but the echoes of what happened that night remained etched in my mind. Nobody, not even the authorities, could ever explain the disappearances, the footprints, or the strange noises that haunted us. We returned home with more questions than answers, and with the clear feeling that somewhere in those mountains, something is still waiting. Sometimes when I pass near the mountains, I wonder if we were really the ones who got lost, or if somehow it was the forest that allowed us to leave. My name is Laura, and the reason I'm telling you this is because after what I experienced, I feel someone else should know. I'm not a person prone to believing in superstitions or horror stories, but what happened during that weekend camping trip completely changed the way I see things. It all started a couple of months ago when Thomas, my boyfriend, and I decided to take a weekend trip to the mountains. He had always wanted to go to an isolated place where we could disconnect from routine, and it seemed like a perfect idea to me. We found a cabin in a remote area, near a lake in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, about 3 hours by car from the city. The place was perfect, far from everything, surrounded by nature. ideal for relaxing and spending time together. Friday afternoon, we arrived at the site. The cabin was small, rustic, but cozy. It had a stone fireplace in the center of the room, a simple kitchen, and a small window that looked out to the forest. The place had that calm that only sites removed from civilization can offer. Everything seemed in order until I saw something strange on the wooden table at the entrance. It was a folded sheet of paper with disorganized handwriting, almost hurried. At first, I thought someone had left it by accident, but when I opened it, the handwriting made me stop. It said, "If you find this note, you must leave before sunset. No matter what happens, don't stay any longer. There's something here you don't understand. Leave immediately. Don't come after nightfall. Don't do it." The note was handwritten with unmistakable calligraphy, but what puzzled me even more was the sense of urgency it conveyed. I looked at Thomas, who was in the kitchen, taking some things out of the backpacks, and I showed him the paper. I thought maybe it was a joke or some kind of warning for tourists, but seeing his face, his expression changed. He looked at it, folded it, and put it in his backpack without saying anything. "Don't worry about it, Laura. Maybe it's something from the people who were here before. It's nothing," he said, but something inside me wouldn't let me be calm. There was something about that message that I couldn't get out of my head. I couldn't ignore it completely. Who would leave a note like that, and why? Still, I decided not to dwell on it. Thomas was right. It could have been an old warning or something someone left by accident. The afternoon passed quietly. We cooked, played cards, and sat by the fireplace. The darkness began to fall slowly, and the peace we felt remained in the air. The sound of wind moving through the trees was our only company. However, as the night grew deeper, there began to be something strange in the atmosphere. Suddenly, the sound of the wind stopped. The silence was so deep that you could hear the fireplace embers crackling. It was then that I saw something else, something I really couldn't explain. I was standing looking out the window toward the forest when I saw something move between the trees. It wasn't an animal, I knew that. It moved too quickly, and the figure, though difficult to distinguish, seemed human. I froze but didn't say anything. I thought I might be imagining it. Thomas was beside me, but he didn't seem to notice anything strange. "Are you okay?" he asked, seeing that I was staring fixedly toward the outside. "Yes, I just think I saw something out there," I replied, trying to sound calm. Thomas got up to approach the window and look, but seeing that there was nothing, he laughed. "Laura, you're too tense. It's late. Better get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll go out to explore." Although I tried to calm down, something kept bothering me. That feeling that something wasn't right wouldn't leave me. The place, no matter how beautiful it was, seemed to have a kind of invisible weight, as if something was watching us. I decided to go to bed, but before closing my eyes, I looked toward the door that was slightly ajar. The curious thing was that the door was closed when we arrived. I got up and approached, thinking maybe Thomas had left it open without realizing it, but no, it was closed. I didn't know what to think. Maybe the wind had moved it, but it seemed strange that I hadn't heard any noise. The night passed without further incidents, but at dawn, something else happened. When I woke up, I noticed the fireplace was no longer lit, although we had clearly left it burning the night before. When I got up to check, I saw there was something else on the floor, a piece of crumpled fabric, as if someone had dropped it when leaving. I didn't recognize the fabric, but its texture seemed strangely familiar. I went to the bathroom trying to stay calm, but when I returned, I noticed something even more disturbing. Thomas's backpack was on the floor, completely open, and his things were out of place. I looked around searching for Thomas, but he wasn't anywhere in the cabin. I called his name several times and heard him respond from outside. I went out hurriedly and found him looking toward the forest, very still. He was like in a trance, his face serious, without reacting to my presence. "Thomas, what's wrong?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just kept looking ahead. I squeezed his shoulder to get his attention, and he finally reacted. He came to, but his face was pale and his eyes glassy. What's happening?" he asked in a low voice, as if he didn't know why he was outside. "Are you okay? I saw you staring fixedly at the forest. Do you feel all right?" I asked, worried. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He just looked toward the tree, then toward the ground, as if he was trying to find something that would make sense of what had happened. Finally, he shrugged. "It's like, I don't know, something's not right here." Back in the cabin, I found the note I had left on the table. It was folded again, and I realized it was no longer the same. Something had altered it, as if it had been touched after I had read it. The message was no longer clear. It had been partially crossed out, and only fragments could be read like "Don't stay" and "Before nightfall." The afternoon was advancing, and the sun was beginning to descend. Something inside me was telling me we should leave, that it was best. But before I could tell Thomas, a scream tore through the air coming from the forest. It wasn't an animal or a normal sound. It was a human voice loaded with desperation. Without thinking, we took our backpacks and began walking back toward the car. As we moved away, I looked one last time toward the forest. What I saw froze my blood. From among the trees, a dark figure was watching us, motionless, almost floating. I don't know what exactly happened that afternoon, or what we found in that place, but what I do know is that I'll never return to that forest again. Neither Thomas nor I have talked about what happened. We know it wasn't a dream, but something warns us that we shouldn't know more. The things we saw, heard, and felt there are better left forgotten. My name is Sebastian, and although I was never an expert in mountaineering or camping, I always liked the idea of spending a weekend in contact with nature. The clean air, the tranquility, the sound of wind through the trees, all of that attracted me. That's why when a group of friends decided to organize an excursion through a remote forest in northern Michigan, I didn't hesitate for a second. There were 5 of us in total, me, Luke, the most experienced at camping. Sophia, a friend from college who joined out of pure curiosity, Tom and Carla, a couple who had just started dating, and Mike, the quietest of all, who seemed to have a special connection with nature. All of us were enthusiastic, but at the same time, there was something in the air we couldn't identify. The atmosphere in that forest, though beautiful, had something strange. The environment was dense, as if the trees were watching us. The hike began in the morning with the sun barely peeking through the treetops. Luke, who had planned the route, led us with a firm step, pointing out the way while telling us stories about the forest. "This place is one of the oldest in the region," he told us. "Here among these trees, there are tales of strange beings, legends from centuries ago. But well, those are just stories, right?" I remember we laughed at his words. Nobody thought about those legends. We were just excited about the adventure. During the first few hours, Everything seemed to be in order. We walked along narrow trails, crossed small streams, stopped to take photos and rest, enjoying the beauty of the landscape. However, as the afternoon progressed, we began to notice something odd. I wouldn't know how to explain it, but there was something in the air that felt different. The fog began to rise from the ground, darkening the landscape, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should. Despite having maps and compasses, Luke began to look around with slight concern. "I'm not sure where we are," he murmured, as if he didn't want the others to hear him. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, or a common mistake among those not accustomed to these terrains. But soon, I realized something wasn't right. The natural references Luke used for orientation didn't seem to match what we were seeing. The terrain we should have crossed hours ago didn't appear anywhere. In fact, it seemed like we had returned to the same point several times. "Are we going in circles?" Sophia asked, seeing the growing concern on everyone's faces. Tom, who had remained silent the whole time, nodded, but his face showed an expression of bewilderment. "I think we should stop and check the map carefully," I suggested. But before we could make a decision, Mike, the quietest of the group, pointed to something on the ground. "Look at this," he said, crouching down to point out some marks in the mud. We all approached. The footprints weren't from animals or from the trails we had traveled. They were human footprints, but strangely very light, as if someone had walked there unhurriedly, as if making sure not to be noticed. There were no traces of disturbed earth or broken branches, just the footprints in the mud, perfect in their form but very thin. "This doesn't make sense," Luke said, frowning. "We're the only ones in this area." But the footprints continued, as if someone was guiding us, leaving us signals to follow them. We decided to follow them, thinking maybe we would find some kind of clue to orient ourselves, or even someone who could help us get out of there. But as we advanced, the footprints became more confusing. Sometimes they appeared right in front of us, but other times they vanished suddenly, as if the person who had left them had disappeared without a trace. Uneasiness began to settle in us. While we continued, the sky darkened rapidly, and the fog thickened even more. The temperature began to drop, and a cold wind began to blow through the trees, making the leaves crackle under our feet. "What do we do now?" Carla asked, looking around with fear in her eyes. "This isn't normal." Luke tried to calm her, but the truth was none of us knew what to do. Tom no longer seemed so calm, and Sophia, normally optimistic, also began to show signs of anxiety. We decided to take a break and check the map again, but it was useless. We were completely disoriented. It was at that moment that something even stranger happened. From the depths of the forest, or perhaps from closer than we expected, we heard a sound. It was a soft crackling, but it clearly came from something moving through the trees. In the distance, someone or something was walking with firm steps. We all looked at the same time toward the origin of the sound, but we saw nobody. "Who's there?" Luke shouted, but the voice he launched was quickly lost in the thick fog. Nobody answered. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound of the footsteps. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched intensified. We didn't know if we were imagining it, but we all had the same sensation. Someone was following us or guiding us, but we couldn't see them. We decided to keep walking despite the fear. The sensation of being stalked enveloped us more and more. In the midst of our growing anguish, the footprints we had been following seemed to become more intense. But no matter how much we searched carefully, we couldn't find the person leaving them. Every time the footprints seemed to get closer, they vanished without explanation. The forest, which before seemed fascinating and serene, now felt like a prison. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and the tree branches creaked with the wind in a strange way, as if they were moving alone, following some kind of pattern. Panic began to grow in all of us. Who was there? Why were they leaving us these footprints and following us without showing themselves? After what seemed like an eternity of walking in circles, a scream broke the air. It was Sophia, who had tripped over a root hidden under the thick fog. As we quickly approached her, her face showed terror. "Look, look," she screamed, pointing toward the ground. We approached and saw something even more disturbing. They weren't just footprints. In the mud next to the footprints, there was something else, something that froze our blood. It wasn't just footprints. In the mud beside the footprints, there was something more, something that seemed to be scrawled with what looked like blood, but we couldn't decipher what it said. "We have to get out of here now," Luke said with a trembling voice. His usual confidence was no longer there. It was obvious we were all terrified. We decided to return to the campsite. There was no other option. As we walked back, the footprints seemed to disappear behind us, but the feeling of being watched remained. There was something or someone that didn't want us to leave that forest. Finally, upon reaching the campsite, the fog dissipated a bit, and the sensation of being pursued diminished, but it never completely disappeared. We didn't see or hear anything else that night. We stayed by the fire, but none of us slept. Anxiety and fear had overtaken us. The next day, the sun shone again, and the forest seemed to have returned to normal. However, something had changed in us. Although we found the way back without problems, the feeling that something had followed us or had guided us never left. Nobody talked about the subject during the return, but we all knew that what had happened that night was something that couldn't be explained with words. That forest, with its deceptive tranquility, had become a place we would never forget. And no matter how much we tried to rationalize it, the question kept haunting our minds. Who or what had been following us that night, leaving us traces to follow without ever managing to find them? My name is Manuel, and I'm a civil engineer. A few years ago, I was assigned a construction project for a new highway in a small town in northern Idaho. It was a common job, nothing out of the ordinary, just another project that would allow us to expand infrastructure and better connect the region. However, I never imagined that something so simple would lead me to discover a mystery that had remained hidden for generations. Everything began in early April, when a team of workers and I arrived in the area to conduct a preliminary analysis of the terrain. The place was surrounded by hills and pine forests, with fresh, clean air, but with something unsettling in the quietness of the place. There was something strange in the atmosphere, but at first, I attributed it to the long hours of work under the sun. The construction had to cross an extension of field that was located at the edge of a small river that grew tremendously during rainy seasons. Everything seemed in order until one day, while we were conducting excavations for the foundation, the shovel of a backhoe hit something hard. It wasn't a simple block of stone or a thick root. Something that seemed more solid, something that didn't belong to the terrain. Curious, I approached and asked them to continue digging. As the machinery advanced, a piece of carved stone was unearthed, It looked like a piece of some old tombstone. The atmosphere became tense. The foreman, an older man who had been in the business for years, looked at me worried. "Are you sure this isn't just a stone?" He asked me in a low tone while the shovel continued removing earth. I decided to investigate further. With the help of some workers, we kept unearthing more pieces until we realized we were facing what appeared to be an ancient cemetery. The earth, which we originally thought was just mud and rocks, was full of fragments of funeral stones, and some even had almost illegible inscriptions. At that moment, my instinct told me I should stop everything and communicate it to the authorities. But before doing so, a strange feeling invaded me. Something wasn't right, as if this entire discovery had been better left forgotten. I went to the town's small store to find out if anyone knew anything about the place. The store was at the end of Main Street, right in front of the square. A middle-aged woman with a disturbing gaze attended to me, as if everything surrounding that town were alien to her. "What do you need, young man?" she asked while arranging some milk boxes on the shelf. "I was investigating the terrain where we're working, and it seems there are remains of an old cemetery." "Do you know anything about that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. At first, she didn't say anything. She looked at me steadily as if evaluating whether she should talk to me or not. Finally, she told me in a low voice, as if she feared someone else might hear. "That's not something people talk about, young man. Better forget it. There are things it's better not to know. The earth has its secrets. Sometimes it's better not to dig them up." Her response left me uneasy. Upon leaving the store, I felt the town people's eyes observing me. They looked at me with a mixture of distrust and suspicion, as if they knew something I didn't. I decided to ignore it and continue with my investigation. But the more I delved into it, the more convinced I became that something strange had happened on that land. During the following weeks, I spent my days reviewing the cemetery remains. I went to City Hall to investigate historical archives, and what I found left me frozen. It turns out that more than 100 years ago, this town had been the scene of a tragedy, a cholera epidemic that killed almost half the population. The dead were buried quickly, without proper ceremonies, and the graves were forgotten. But the most chilling thing of all was that, according to records, many of the people buried hadn't died from the disease, but had been victims of something much worse. As the days passed, a strange story I'd heard among the town's elderly began to haunt me. They said that before the epidemic, there had been a series of mysterious deaths, all related to a group of people who had been arrested and buried in the same cemetery. It was rumored that this group had been practicing dark rituals, trying to invoke forces they couldn't control. The story said something had gone wrong, that the dead didn't rest in peace, and that the epidemic had been the price of that dark intervention. People stopped talking about it, but the fear remained engraved in future generations. I decided I needed to investigate more, but that night something happened that made me doubt. I was in the field near the cemetery when I heard the sound of footsteps in the distance. I thought it was one of the workers, but when I turned around, I saw no one. My flashlight illuminated the river's edge, where I saw something strange, a dark figure with its head down, as if it were looking for something in the water. I breathed deeply and approached, but upon reaching the edge, there was no trace of the figure. It was as if it had never been there. From that moment on, I began to notice stranger things. In the mornings, when I arrived at the construction site, I saw footprints in the mud, as if someone had walked during the night. At first, I thought they were animals, but those prints didn't resemble those of any common animal in the area. They were too large and strange, as if something much bigger had walked through there. And every time I followed them, they led me to the same point, near the cemetery ruins. The workers began to feel uncomfortable. Several began to miss work without explanation, and those who showed up to work seemed nervous, with their eyes constantly looking toward the forest surrounding the highway. It was evident that something was disturbing them, although none of them wanted to talk about it. One afternoon, the foreman approached me with a somber face. "Manuel, I can't continue with this," he told me in a low voice. "There's something strange about this place, and I don't want to be part of it. The town people are afraid you'll unearth more things. I've already heard stories. You should leave too. You're playing with fire." That same night, while I was in my apartment in town, I received an unexpected visit. It was one of the community's most respected elders, Don Aurelius. He looked at me with tired eyes, but full of wisdom. "Young man, I'm going to tell you this only once. Leave that job. What you found there, what you unearthed, isn't something you should bring to light. The earth has already swallowed too much. We, the town people, have learned to live with this secret, but you don't know what you're doing." His words left me breathless, but I couldn't stop myself. Curiosity was eating at me. I decided to continue investigating on my own without anyone's help. In the following days, the strange events increased. The footprints in the mud became deeper. People's murmurs turned into rumors that reached my ears, and the nights in the field became disturbing. Finally, on a dark dawn, I decided to return to the excavation site, hoping to find answers. Upon arriving at the cemetery, the air was heavy. I felt something was watching me. With the flashlight in hand, I went among the broken tombs and fallen headstones. It was then that I found something that would change my life forever. A tomb that wasn't in the records, a recent tomb, although there was no corpse in it. On the earth, there was an inscription that said, "The dead do not forget." And at that moment, I understood why no one wanted to talk about the past. The earth was reclaiming what should never have been buried. I remained paralyzed in front of that tomb. The words engraved on the stone made no clear sense in my mind, but something in them resonated in the deepest part of my being. It wasn't an ancient inscription. It didn't belong to the cemetery we were unearthing. It was a recent tomb of someone who shouldn't have been there. I looked around, but the place's silence was absolute, and the cold darkness of dawn only amplified the sensation that something was wrong. I felt the need to leave, but something held me back. The tomb, who had done this? The idea that someone had buried an unknown person there, after everything I'd discovered, turned my stomach. Not only was there a disturbing presence in the air, but that inscription seemed to warn me of something I still couldn't understand. Suddenly, a noise broke the night's quietness. It wasn't a sound of animals or trees creaking in the wind, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, as if someone were talking among the pines. I turned around quickly, but saw no one. My heart began to beat faster. The cold I felt on my skin wasn't just physical. It was a sensation of alarm, as if an invisible presence were stalking me. The flashlight I carried in my hand began to flicker. I tried to stay calm, but my body was beginning to react by instinct. When I put the flashlight back on the tomb, I realized there was something else, something I hadn't seen before. The ground around it was altered. The earth was removed, not as if someone had recently excavated, but as if it had been violently displaced. Then I felt someone touch my shoulder. I screamed, jumping forward, and the flashlight fell to the ground, illuminating for an instant the tomb's edge. I looked quickly, but there was no one, only the dense air charged with invisible tension. I breathed deeply, trying to calm myself, and when I bent down to pick up the flashlight, I saw something that made my heart beat furiously. In the mud to one side of the tomb, there were footprints, but they weren't human footprints. They were large, deep, and something in their shape disturbed me. I stayed there, not knowing what to do. My mind couldn't process the situation. How was it possible that someone had done that without anyone noticing? Who or what had left those footprints? A knot formed in my throat when I thought about Don Aurelius's words. The earth has already swallowed too much. Was I perhaps getting into something I shouldn't? Something bigger, older than any person in town was willing to admit. I decided to return to town at dawn without telling anyone what I'd seen. The feeling of discomfort followed me throughout the journey as daylight began to dissipate the night's shadows. But the truth is I couldn't get the footprints or the tomb out of my head. Something didn't fit. Something in the town, in that cemetery's history, was being hidden. And my obsession with discovering it began to grow more and more in me. That same morning, I went to the town church. It was an old building with thick adobe walls and a tower that rose like a silent sentinel. I knew the church records could give me more information about what had happened here so many years ago. The priest, a man with a grave voice and severe gaze, attended to me with somewhat forced cordiality. "How can I help you, young man?" he asked while cleaning some candles with a cloth. "I'm investigating something related to the cemetery beside the river. I found something that caught my attention. I'd like to know more about the history of the dead here." The priest remained silent for a moment, and for a second it seemed to me he doubted whether to respond or not. Finally, he told me, "That's a story many prefer not to remember. The town went through difficult times in its past. There was an epidemic, yes, but there were also other things. Things you shouldn't try to unearth, young man. Forgetting has been the best remedy for everyone. Sometimes the truth hurts more than ignorance." His words made me feel a chill, but what disturbed me most was the way he said them, as if he were trying to warn me about something I didn't understand. However, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd discovered. Something in all of this didn't add up. If what the priest said was true, and if really no one wanted to remember the past, what were they trying to hide? I decided the only thing I could do was talk to the few elderly people still left in town. Those who, although reluctant, sometimes used to share forgotten stories. After several days of inquiring, a man named Don Jose, who used to be the last to stay in the square when the rest of the inhabitants retired to their homes, agreed to tell me what he knew. He was a man of advanced age with tired eyes, but which maintained a spark of wisdom. "What happened here wasn't just an epidemic, young man," he told me in a low voice while resting on his wooden bench. "The dead came first, but then something else arrived, something that shouldn't have been unearthed." "What are you talking about?" I asked, hoping he'd give me more details. "Those who were buried at first weren't just victims of the plague, they were sacrifices. sacrifices to prevent something worse from happening. When the epidemic began to spread, many of the inhabitants thought the evil that afflicted them wasn't just natural. They believed the earth itself was cursed. That's why a sacrifice was made, although it wasn't a common sacrifice. That night, under the moonlight, the town's elders made a deal with something dark, something the earth shouldn't have known. Don Jose's story was diffuse, full of ambiguous terms, but the fear on his face was palpable. He interrupted himself several times as if he feared continuing. However, before I could press more, he stopped me with a final warning. The earth doesn't forgive. Those who unearth what is hidden end up paying the price. You should leave, young man, before everything you've touched starts turning against you. Don Jose's words kept resonating in my mind. That same night, I stayed in my apartment thinking about everything I'd discovered. The footprints, the inscription on the tomb, the priest's warning, and now Don Jose's words. The idea that someone at some point had tried to contain a dark and dangerous force under that earth left me with an uncomfortable sensation. As if my presence in that place had begun to unleash something that should have remained sealed. At dawn, while walking through town to have coffee, I felt I could no longer stay there. Something had changed. It wasn't just the cemetery or the footprints in the earth. Something else was happening, something I couldn't see, but felt with every fiber of my being. I knew that somehow I'd broken a barrier, and the earth, as they warned me, was reclaiming what belonged to it. My name doesn't matter none. Who I am won't change what happened out there in the desert. I'm only telling this because what I saw at that ranch, time itself couldn't scrub it from my mind. The nightmares still come, even after all these years. This was way out in Dead Horse Canyon, deep in the New Mexico Badlands, where the sun beats down merciless, and the wind carries nothing but dust and regret. I was one of the hands who was there that terrible night. I rode alongside the boss wherever he went, trusted him with my life more times than I can count. I saw most everything I'm about to tell you, and what I didn't see with my own eyes, he told me himself. Every story you hear has truth in it somewhere. All the tales we passed down came from our grandfathers and their grandfathers before them. The old ways haven't gotten weaker, just harder to find. People are scared to tell their stories face to face anymore. Believe me when I say, there's plenty happening on this earth that never makes the newspapers. Listen to my story knowing it's real, and learn from another man's mistakes so you don't make them yourself. Let me tell you about Vincent Barnes. Vincent of the Deadwater, they called him. Got that name because he was born near a dried-up creek bed where nothing would grow, not even the hardiest desert sage. He came from nothing, a family so poor they made church mice look wealthy. No education, no inheritance, no prospects worth mentioning. Vincent started small, selling milk from a handful of goats, hauling firewood into town on the back of an old mule named Jeremiah. He was a hard worker, I'll give him that, but he had something eating at him from the inside, a hunger that wouldn't quit. Vincent used to say he wasn't born to die poor. That's when things started changing with him. He stopped going to Sunday service, quit meeting the boys for drinks on Saturday night, and took to wandering alone in the desert for hours at a time. Word was he'd gone looking for a man down in Espanola, a curandero named Felix Montoya. This Felix, he dealt with the heavy stuff, the kind of magic that makes decent folks cross themselves and hurry past. Vincent came back from that trip different. At first, nobody paid much attention, but within 2 months his whole life turned upside down. This man who couldn't scrape together enough for a decent pair of boots suddenly bought himself a section of land, then another. Acquired a herd of prime cattle, a couple of quarter horses that must have cost more than most folks see in a year, and a brand new Ford pickup truck. Built himself a big adobe house with a red tile roof and a wraparound porch that looked like something out of a magazine. Went from ranch hand to ranch owner overnight, and nobody could figure how. Lucky break, he'd say when asked. The Lord helps those who help themselves. But I'd known Vincent since we were boys catching lizards behind the general store, and I could tell something wasn't right. Too much money, too fast, and that look in his eyes, like a man who'd seen something he wished he could forget. People started whispering that he'd made some kind of deal, traded something precious for all that wealth, but nobody knew what. The answer came years later, and it came with a price none of us were ready to pay. Vincent married Maria Elena Vasquez, a beautiful girl from over in Las Cruces. Sweet as spring water and twice as pure. They had themselves a baby boy they named Danny. When that child turned 3 months old, everything started going to hell. One night before dawn, Vincent woke to the sound of footsteps in the courtyard. He got up slow, grabbed his shotgun from beside the bed, and peered through the window. Nothing there but shadows and moonlight. He checked on the baby. Little Danny was sleeping peaceful as an angel. Vincent tucked the blanket around him, closed the window tight, and stood there listening to the desert silence. The next night he woke again. This time it was a smell, something burning mixed with something rotting. Hit him strong, then faded away like it was never there. Vincent went outside with his gun ready. Nothing but the sound of coyotes howling way off in the distance. On the 3rd day, he decided he'd had enough. Saddled up his horse and rode out to Eagle's Peak to find an old Navajo medicine man named Joseph Crow Feather, known for dealing with the kind of trouble that can't be solved with bullets or fists. Vincent sat on the woven mat, took off his hat, and spoke plain. I made a bargain some time back, and now they're coming to collect. I need to know if there's a way to undo what I've done. The old man listened without saying a word, asked how long ago, and what Vincent had given in return. Vincent couldn't answer. The shame was choking him. Joseph Crow Feather brewed some tea from desert herbs and drew symbols in the sand with a stick. Told Vincent not to be frightened by what he might witness. The medicine man went into a trance, his eyes rolling back white. Then he took a piece of leather and drew with charcoal a circle, a man with a large sack on his back and a small child nearby. Vincent hung his head low. Can it be broken? Vincent whispered. The old man drew again, fire surrounding everything, and 2 paths, one marked with a cross and another with thorns. Then he shook his head slowly and drew a 3rd path, an open grave inside a triangle. Vincent understood. He knew what had to be done. When Vincent got home, he went straight to the bedroom. Sat on the edge of the bed, removed his hat, and stared at the floor like it held all the answers in the world. Maria Elena was in the next room, ironing clothes and humming a lullaby. When she finished, she came in, saw him sitting there like a man at his own funeral, and asked what was troubling him. He told her to sit down. She didn't like the tone in his voice, but she obeyed. He stayed quiet for a long while, like he was trying to find the right words for something that had no right words. Finally, he spoke without looking up. "I made a deal, Maria Elena. Before all this, before the ranch, before the cattle, before the house, before Danny was born. I made it on my own. Nobody forced my hand. I wanted to get rich quick, wanted to skip the hard years, wanted to be more than what I was born to be. Did it one night out in the desert, past Devil's Backbone Ridge. A man taught me how to call something up from the dark places. I called and it came. Didn't give me a name, just told me what it could do. I accepted and made the pact." Maria Elena didn't understand at first, just stared at him, waiting for more explanation. He continued, still looking at the floor. "It promised to give me everything I asked for: land, money, respect. But in return, when the time was right, it would come back for something of mine, and I wouldn't be able to stop it. I agreed because I thought I was being clever, but I wasn't clever at all. Everything we have came after that night in the desert." Maria Elena asked what he had promised to give. Vincent looked at her for the first time and said the words that changed everything. "I didn't ask what it wanted, I just agreed. Now I think it's come to collect what's owed. It's come for our son." She stood up slowly, like she wanted to run but couldn't make her legs work. She said she didn't believe it, that it was all in his head. Vincent didn't argue, just said, "I'm not asking you to believe me, Maria Elena. I'm telling you because its time has come, and if it's here for Danny, I'll kill it or die trying, but nothing's taking my boy without a fight." The conversation ended there. We all sat in silence. That's when I heard it, a whistle, long and high, cutting through the dry desert night. A sound that didn't seem to come from anything human or animal. Maria Elena shrank back, her eyes wide with terror. Vincent went rigid, couldn't even blink. The whistle came from far off, out on the dirt road that led to the ranch. It took its time getting closer, but it never stopped, like something was walking slow and deliberate through the darkness. Suddenly, a shadow appeared on the road, tall and bent, with an enormous sack across its shoulders. The desert wind should have been moving that burlap, but it hung perfectly still. The thing stood in the middle of the road, staring straight at the house. Vincent grabbed his shotgun and didn't say another word. The shadow began walking toward us, each step deliberate and heavy. Then the whistle stopped. Maria Elena clutched baby Danny to her chest, trembling. Vincent stood firm, waiting for whatever was coming next. Without a word, Vincent set his shotgun aside and went to wake the 3 ranch hands sleeping in the bunkhouse. He shook them awake with gestures alone. The men got up silent, armed themselves with whatever they could find: hunting knives, rifles, an old cavalry saber. They barricaded the doors, pushed furniture against the windows, killed all the lights, and huddled together in the darkness, just listening. The whistle came back stronger, closer, seeming to come from every direction at once. Picture this: you're in a house dark as a tomb, miles from the nearest neighbor, hearing those terrifying sounds echoing through the desert night. That whole night was pure terror. The baby slept through it all, and Maria Elena knelt beside his crib, rosary beads clicking in her shaking hands. Vincent stood in the center of the main room, shotgun pointed at the front door. 2 of the hands pressed themselves against the windows, peering through cracks in the boards. The 3rd climbed up to the attic. Outside, the wind picked up fierce, and the shadow on the road vanished. For a moment there was only silence. Then 3 slow knocks on the front door. "He's come to collect," Vincent whispered. Nobody answered. The knocking stopped, but nobody relaxed. Everyone stayed alert, waiting for the next sound. Vincent raised his hand in signal. One of the hands cocked his rifle, another crept to a window crack, saw nothing but black desert, everything still as death. Then came footsteps, slow and dragging, like someone pulling a heavy weight. The sound came from behind the house. Maria Elena held Danny tighter. The child slept on, innocent of the evil surrounding him. Vincent crossed to the back door and pressed his ear against the wood. From outside came a whistle, long and thin and steady. Didn't sound like it came from any human throat. Vincent kept the door locked, finger firm on the trigger. Then came a crash, the kitchen window, glass spiderwebbing. One of the hands ran to look, but saw no sign of what had done it. Vincent said nothing, just went upstairs, took the baby, and told Maria Elena to get up to the attic with Danny and not come down no matter what. The ranch hands stayed below, one at each door, weapons ready. Outside, we heard the sound of that sack being dragged across the hard-packed earth. Slow and patient, like whatever was out there had all the time in the world. Then the windows started breaking, one after another. First the parlor, then the kitchen, explosions of glass echoing through the house. The front door shook on its hinges, like something was pounding it from both sides at once. You know those moving pictures where demons attack and windows explode, doors slam, lights go out? That's exactly what was happening. That's why I say what we faced was a demon, and nothing will change my mind. The ranch hands gathered in the hallway. Vincent barred the last remaining door. Maria Elena held Danny in the attic. The boy had woken up but wasn't crying, just staring with those big dark eyes, watching his mother's face. That's when everything went black. Every light in the house died at once. The oil lamps guttered and went out. We were left with nothing but the sounds from outside, footsteps and the dragging of that sack, a whistle getting higher and closer. Inside the house, nobody dared to breathe. We didn't even have the courage to pray. Time seemed to stop. Could have been a minute or an hour, nobody would have been able to say. Then came absolute silence, a silence like I've never heard before or since. Maria Elena pressed Danny against her chest. Vincent leaned his shotgun against his leg and waited. Sweat dripped from his face, pattering on the floor like rain. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, weak at first, then steady. Vincent looked at his men. Nobody moved, not even a muscle twitch. Outside, everything was quiet. Seemed like whatever had been hunting us had given up and gone away. We stayed put for a while, listening. One of the hands cracked open a window. Nothing out there, clean ground, no tracks, no sign anything had ever been there. Just a light breeze moving through the sage brush. Vincent went down to the kitchen, called for Maria Elena to come down too. She came with Danny wrapped in a thick blanket. We all sat around the table. Some of us even laughed nervous-like, thinking we'd won, that the nightmare was over. Maria Elena went to adjust the blanket. Wanted to see if Danny was sleeping peaceful. When she pulled back the cloth, she let out a scream that cut through the house like a blade. In her arms wasn't a baby anymore, just small bones, cold and clean, like they'd been washed white by desert wind. She collapsed to the floor, screaming Vincent's name. He stood frozen, paralyzed. The blanket fell, and those tiny bones clattered on the wooden floor with a sound like rattling stones. That's when we heard the whistle again, far off on the dirt road. Thin and long and final. We ran to the porch. There it was, that thing with the sack on its back, tall and hunched, walking slow and steady, disappearing into the darkness. And from inside that sack came the sound of little Danny crying. We had no time to react. The creature melted into a dark mist, and the whistle grew fainter and fainter until it was gone. Danny was never seen again. The story spread through the territory like wildfire, became legend in those parts. Then, like most legends, it faded. People who told it got called liars and fools. Vincent and Maria Elena sold the ranch within the month and took their grief with them. Nobody knows where they went. What I want to tell you folks is this: read the old books, study the ancient ways. They're full of accounts of supernatural attacks. We live our lives and don't look deep enough into these matters. Most people go through life never knowing how thin the wall is between our world and the dark places beyond it. But that wall can be broken, and sometimes the price of breaking it is higher than any man should have to pay. I thank you for listening to my account, and I bid you all a good night. I ain't nobody special, never was. Don't got no fancy education, no big name that people know. And I ain't here to teach nobody nothing either. I'm just here to tell you what I seen with these very eyes that the earth's gonna take someday. All them stories folks tell around here about haunts and strange creatures, things that appear and disappear like smoke. Most everyone says it's just make-believe, just scared country folk letting their minds run wild. But what I'm about to tell you wasn't no dream, wasn't no story I heard down at Murphy's bar, wasn't no gossip you pick up around town. This happened to me, and even now, if I close my eyes too long, I'm right back there on that night. My name's Eugene, and I'm 58 years old now. When all this went down, I was 34. I worked construction then, mixed concrete, laid brick, that kind of backbreaking work. Lived in a little shotgun house with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged like an old man's back. This all happened outside of Shreveport, down in the bayou country where the cypress trees grow thick and the Spanish moss hangs like curtains. I'd always been curious about religion. Been to Baptist churches, sat through Methodist services, even went to a Catholic mass once or twice, but nothing ever really took hold. There was always something missing, something that didn't quite grab me. Then one day, this fellow I worked with named Jerome asked me if I wanted to come see about the voodoo. Said it was good stuff, helped people, and put your head on straight. I went along mostly out of curiosity, not really knowing what I was getting into. The place was in the back of this old Creole woman's house. Mama Celeste, they called her. She was one of them root workers everyone in the neighborhood knew about. The house was on a dead-end street, full of potholes and broken pavement. Had walls with paint peeling off like dried skin, and a screen door that squeaked like a dying cat. But when we walked in, the smell hit you right away. Sage and sweetgrass and cigar smoke, all mixed together in the thick Louisiana air. It was exactly what you'd expect from a place like that. Had drums in the corner, bottles of rum on a makeshift altar, and 7-day candles burning steady. When them drums started up, the sound went right through your chest. Was like getting hit with a sledgehammer. Felt something cold creep up my spine and settle at the base of my neck. That first night, I just watched and listened. I came back the next week, and the week after that. Started sweeping the floor, tidying up the altar, lighting candles. just sort of became part of the place. People started calling me an assistant, but I just said I was there to help out. One evening, Papa Thibodeaux pulled me aside. He was the head man there, the one who ran the ceremonies. Short fellow, quiet as a grave, always had these half-closed eyes like he could see things behind you that you couldn't. He wore red and white beads around his neck, went barefoot, and always had a cigar hanging from his lips. He walked up to me and said, "Eugene, you ready? Next week we got an offering to make, and I want you to come along." I didn't ask no questions, just nodded my head. Back then, I didn't know that offerings could be heavy business, that crossroads could be doorways to other places, and that when you leave something for the spirits, sometimes what comes to collect it ain't exactly what you'd call a spirit of light. When the night came, I went, and I seen things that no living person should ever have to see. The offering was on a Wednesday night, one of them thick, humid nights when the air sits on you like a wet blanket, and you can't hear nothing but the cicadas. We left after 10 o'clock, walking through the dark. It was me, Papa Thibodeaux, and this woman I'd never seen before. She kept her eyes on the ground, carrying one of the baskets, had a black cloth folded over her arm. I walked quiet, not knowing what to expect. We passed the last streetlight in the neighborhood and headed down this old dirt road, rutted from farm equipment and dark as the inside of a coffin. The ground was full of rocks and scrub brush, and the crossroads was up ahead where two old farm roads met in the middle of nowhere. During the day, it wouldn't have spooked nobody, but at night, it felt like a completely different place. Papa Thibodeaux stopped and said this was it. He spread out the cloth real careful. Inside was cornmeal, candles, cigars, raw meat, a piece of paper with writing on it, and a bottle of bourbon. He arranged everything on the ground real slow, had the woman light the candle. She got down on her knees and lit it without saying a word. The flame flickered even though there wasn't no wind. Then he started the chant. It was a slow, dragging kind of song with a deep, rough voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. His eyes never blinked once. I just stood there watching, feeling the cold ground through my work boots. In the middle of all that chanting, I could sense something in the woods. Wasn't no sound or movement, just something my body knew was there. When I looked to the side, I seen it across the road, standing in the middle of the trees. Couldn't make out no face, couldn't tell if it was a man or an animal or something else entirely. All I knew was it was way too tall. The head was huge, hanging forward like it was too heavy for the neck. The arms just hung loose like they didn't have no bones in them. And the skin, if that's what it was, looked dark and shiny, like wet leather. The thing didn't walk normal. It sort of glided, and it made this sound that wasn't coming from no throat or mouth. It was like a dry clicking, like bones breaking inside a chest cavity. It came closer, stopped right next to the candle, and bent down. When it crouched, it made this awful sound like old wood splitting. And then came the smell. Lord, I never smelled nothing like it before or since. Hard to describe, but it was like something burning mixed with rusty metal and old candle wax. Burned right up into my nose and made my eyes water. The candle went out. Papa Thibodeaux kept on chanting, but his voice was different now, shaky. The woman kept her head down like she wasn't even there. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't move. That thing just stood there breathing for what felt like forever. Didn't take nothing from the offering, just stayed there. Then it straightened up real slow, turned around, and headed back into the woods like it was sinking into the earth itself. Didn't make no sound when it left. Papa Thibodeau stopped chanting, folded up the cloth, and the woman stood up. Nobody said nothing. We walked back carrying this weight on our shoulders that wasn't just from the long walk. Felt like we'd crossed some kind of line and left something important behind. That night I couldn't sleep. Just sat on the edge of my bed with my eyes wide open in the dark, listening to every sound from the street, wondering if it was footsteps. My body was cold with sweat, but my mind was hot and heavy, going over everything I'd seen. Next day I went to work like nothing had happened, picked up my trowel and started laying brick. But I didn't talk to nobody. When folks asked if I was all right, I just said I was tired. Being tired is a good excuse. People don't push when you say you're tired. That woman who came with us never showed up again. Nobody mentioned her name, nobody talked about her, like she'd been borrowed just for that one night. At the next ceremony, Papa Thibodeau seen me in the corner, organizing some cloths. He stared at me for a few seconds, then just nodded his head without saying nothing. But I understood. I was supposed to keep quiet about what I seen that night. 2 days later, this man turned up dead in the neighborhood. Real troublemaker, always starting fights and causing problems. Had it in for the voodoo house. Used to throw rocks at the place, yell at people going in and out. Once he threatened to beat up one of the young men who helped at the altar. He went to one of them Baptist churches nearby and couldn't stand what went on at Mama Celeste's place. They found his body in his backyard, laying on his back with his eyes and mouth wide open. Nobody heard no screaming, nobody heard no gunshots, and there wasn't no blood anywhere. Looked like he just laid down and died. I went to look with everyone else, but I didn't say nothing. There were tracks around the body, but they weren't normal tracks. They were wide and deep, like a hoof had pressed down into the mud. Must have been 5 or 6 prints around the body, but they didn't lead nowhere. Didn't come from nowhere and didn't go nowhere, just appeared right there. People said it was punishment from God, said he died of fright, said his heart gave out. But I kept my mouth shut because I knew where it came from, and I knew I better not get involved. After that day, I stopped going to the voodoo house. Didn't tell nobody, didn't argue with nobody, just stopped showing up. Kept what I seen locked up in my throat because I didn't want them thinking I was gonna talk. Wasn't scared of people, was scared of what might come after me. I kept working construction, but I stayed quiet. Even my coworkers started noticing I'd changed. When they asked again, I just said I was tired. Few days later, I went to the corner store to buy some bread. Walking back home when I seen Papa Thibodeau coming from the other direction. Bare feet, slow steps, and them beads around his neck. He stopped right in front of me, put his hand on my shoulder, and stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We don't choose what we see, we just see it. But you got to learn to let it go. This is something you carry quiet." I just nodded my head, told him I was fine, and I was gonna get on with my life. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking I heard that clicking sound, the same one from the crossroads. Sometimes it seemed to come from the kitchen, sometimes from the window. Started getting paranoid, thinking Papa Thibodeau was worried I was gonna talk, that I was gonna go to the dead man's family and tell them what I seen. Got all twisted up in my head. That's when the strange things started happening. Next morning, still dark outside, I went to open the front door. The dirt in my yard was all torn up, had tracks in it, two deep ones that looked like they carried serious weight. Wasn't human prints, wasn't from no animal I knew. They were wide and round, pressed down so deep that mud was squeezing up around the edges. The tracks were right there in front of my door, like the thing had stopped for a while and just stood there watching before it disappeared. Didn't leave no trail. Same situation as where they found the body. Just them tracks sitting there with no direction of coming or going. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down in my chair. Didn't talk to nobody about it, not neighbors, not family. Late that afternoon, I went back to the store. Bought a candle, a little bag of cornmeal, and got a shot of bourbon in a plastic cup. Went home, got an old enamel plate, put everything on it, covered it with a rag I used for drying dishes, and waited for dark. When everything got quiet, I walked to the back corner of my yard where the woods started. Left the plate on the ground. Didn't ask for nothing, didn't say nothing, just left it there. Went back inside, locked the door, turned off the lights, and went to bed. That night I actually slept. Next morning I went to check. The candle had burned down halfway. The cornmeal was gone, and so was the bourbon. The rag too. Only thing left was the plate, and inside it was a stone. Round, smooth stone, covered in mud. I didn't touch it, just picked up the plate real careful and put it under an old bucket by the fence, face down. After that I never seen nothing else, but every now and then at night that smell comes back. Don't happen often, but when it does, it comes out of nowhere. I don't know what it is, but I know there's things all around us, even when we try our best to forget. And what showed up at that crossroads, I'll never forget as long as I live. That was proof to me that everything people talk about, supernatural stuff, life after death, all that, especially God, it's all real. It's all right there in front of us. We just can't see it most of the time. Well, that's my story. Y'all have a good night now. My name is Michael, and I've decided to share what happened to me a couple of years ago when I embarked on a solo journey through the forests of northern Maine. People usually think I'm brave or reckless for doing it, but the truth is it was more of an impulsive decision than a reasoned one. I'd been listening to stories about that vast region for a long time, about its solitude and wild beauty, and I thought being alone there would be a way to connect with myself. I didn't expect, however, that the forest would teach me such harsh lessons, that nature would remind me so brutally that humans are nothing more than a speck of dust in the immensity of the world. At first, everything was perfect. I spent the first few days in a state of absolute well-being. The cold morning air, the enormous pines that seemed to touch the sky, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. The solitude I had been seeking in my life materialized in a way that filled me completely. In the morning, the sun barely touched the horizon, and the golden light showed me a landscape worthy of a painting. Each step took me further from civilization, and each night when I set up my tent, I felt I was closer to finding myself. My plan was to walk for a couple of weeks, going deeper and deeper into the forest, following an old trail I had found on a map. I didn't carry any type of communication equipment or GPS, just the basics to survive, and a machete to cut branches and make my way through the undergrowth. The tranquility of not having to talk to anyone was something that made me feel free. On the fourth day of my journey, something I hadn't anticipated happened, a strange sound at the end of the afternoon. I was about to set up my camp near a small creek when I heard something that froze me for an instant. It wasn't an animal, or at least not the typical noise you'd expect from local wildlife. It was a crackling, as if someone was walking among the trees, but I couldn't distinguish where it came from. I stayed silent, watching the shadows that lengthened as the sun began to set. The sound ceased after a short while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I thought I was probably exaggerating. Who would be out there so far from civilization? However, that night, I couldn't stop looking at the shadows formed by the pines around my campsite. The sound in my ears wouldn't fade, and although the fatigue of a long day forced me to sleep, I couldn't relax completely. As the hours passed, I felt the disturbing sensation of being watched. I tried not to give it too much importance, but when I woke up at dawn, I noticed that the tracks I had left when setting up the tent had been disturbed slightly, as if someone had walked through my campsite. At first, I took it as paranoia. My mind, exhausted by physical effort and lack of social interaction, was playing tricks on me. Despite everything, I felt the need to continue. After all, I still had much to explore. The next day, the bewilderment turned into something more disturbing. While walking on the trail, I noticed fresh tracks in the mud. They were large, deep, but I couldn't determine what type of animal they came from. The tracks seemed to follow me as if someone was advancing in the same direction. Sometimes the tracks would fade as if the being that had left them had taken a different course, only to appear further ahead, always on my path. The sensation of being followed grew with each step I took. I tried to reason that everything was a product of my tired mind, but the idea that there was something else there in the shadows of the forest began to gain ground. That night, when I stopped to rest beside a small lake, the air was colder than usual, and the wind seemed to whisper among the trees. I decided to light a fire, not out of necessity, but for the sense of security that fire gave me. While I sat beside the flames, I heard a crackling in the distance coming from the other side of the lake. I got up quickly and extinguished the firelight so as not to make myself visible. The sound was increasing, and soon I could distinguish a figure moving slowly among the trees. It wasn't an animal. The silhouette seemed human, and although it was at a considerable distance, something in its posture made me think it wasn't a simple hiker. It was someone who moved with a disturbing calm, as if waiting for something. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't risk confronting that unknown presence, so I took what little I could carry and went into the forest in the opposite direction. I didn't know if that figure was following me, or if it had simply perceived me and had also decided to move away. What I did know is that fear took complete hold of me. The silence of the forest, which had always seemed welcoming to me, became oppressive. The sound of my breathing and my steps was the only thing that broke the stillness of the night. With each step I took, I felt the presence behind me, so subtle but so clear at the same time. A human being doesn't move with that tranquility in such a hostile environment. Something wasn't right. 2 more days passed, and the sensation of being followed only intensified. During daily walks, the tracks kept appearing and disappearing, but always in the same direction. I felt completely observed, as if someone was one step away from me at all times. It was then that I decided not to camp anymore, and what had been a trip planned to enjoy nature became a constant flight. I couldn't return by the same trail. I feared it was a trap to catch me, so I changed my route again and again. However, the figure never disappeared. One afternoon, while walking through a denser section of forest, I heard something that froze my blood. A laugh, a low, drawn-out laugh, coming from among the trees. It wasn't a human laugh, although it had that unmistakable tone. My heart stopped for a second, and my whole body tensed. I didn't know whether to keep walking or stay still. My mind tried to find a rational explanation, but everything my instinct told me was that I was in danger. Fear seized me with an indescribable force. However, I couldn't give up. I had to reach a safe place. Finally, after days of walking without rest, I managed to reach a deserted road. I was exhausted. My feet were bleeding and my thoughts were confused. I didn't see anyone else on that road, but looking behind me, I knew I wasn't alone. Something or someone had followed me to the end. The sensation that that presence had accompanied me throughout the entire trip didn't disappear until I got into a vehicle and drove away. No one else understood what I had lived through. No one comprehended what I felt. Because the tracks I left in that forest, the tracks that followed me, weren't those of an animal or another human being. Today, when I talk about that, it's difficult to explain what really happened, but what I know for certain is that that forest has a way of trapping the souls that venture into it. I was one of those souls, and I still feel that shadow never let me go. Days passed after my exit from the forest, and although I was safe, the memory of everything I had experienced followed me like a persistent shadow. It wasn't just about the discomfort of the days when I felt pursued, but the constant sensation that something was watching me even in the city, among the streets and people. The simple act of closing my eyes at night brought back those sounds, that laugh that resonated in my head like an echo of something I couldn't understand. When I arrived in the city, I tried to forget everything I had lived through, or at least put it in a secluded corner of my mind. In the first weeks after my return, I went back to routine. Work, home, the typical conversations with friends who didn't understand why I had decided to do such a crazy thing. They looked at me like someone who had had a bad experience, but had already overcome the fear. Because people always tend to believe that moments of terror are just that fleeting and surmountable moments. No one seemed to notice the anguish that followed me. The knot in my stomach that tightened every time I saw something moving in the shadows of my periphery, when I heard a crack in the early morning, or when a strange murmur reached my ears for no apparent reason. One night, after several weeks of having returned, I had the recurring dream again. I was in the forest alone, and I could perfectly hear the steps behind me, always soft but relentless. I tried to walk faster, but I couldn't. The branches that once crackled under my feet now moved under the pressure of those steps that didn't cease. And when I looked back, the figure was always a couple of meters away, hidden among the trees. It wouldn't let me approach, wouldn't let me escape. I woke up sweating with my heart racing, and for a moment I didn't know if I was still dreaming or if something had finally caught up with me. At that instant, I decided it was time to investigate more thoroughly. I was convinced that my experience hadn't been a mere product of my disturbed mind, of that romantic idea one has when venturing alone into nature. No, something had been there with me. Something had followed my steps, and I couldn't remain with the doubt. I had to know what it was. I spoke with some friends who knew more about the area than I did. I asked them casually if there had been any news or rumors about strange encounters in the nearby forests. I didn't tell them everything I had lived through. Of course, I didn't think they would believe me, but I mentioned that I had felt a presence. Immediately, one of them, an older man named Peter, looked at me with some seriousness, as if the words I had uttered somehow disturbed him. "What you describe isn't so rare," he said after a long silence. "The forest has its own rules, and not everyone understands how they work." I remained silent, waiting for him to continue, and after a few moments, Peter leaned toward me as if he were going to tell me a secret. "There are people who live there, man. You won't see them. Of course, they don't let themselves be seen. But some say they're not simply people. Nobody knows where they come from. But people who have gotten lost in those lands sometimes appear changed, not physically, but with something strange in their eyes. I don't know, something in their gaze." "What are you saying?" I asked, more out of curiosity than fear. Peter shook his head as if he didn't want to talk more about the matter, but before getting up, he said something that froze me completely. "I just know you're not the first who talks about something like that. Sometimes people disappear, yes, but other times there are those who say they're followed, and not all manage to get out alive. Don't take it lightly, Michael. Back at my house, the sensation that something was watching me, though less constant, became a more present reality than ever." During the following weeks, I reviewed the map of the trail I had traveled looking for some type of logical explanation. I found nothing out of the ordinary. On the contrary, the tracks I had seen were too strange for someone to have left them there on purpose. And the stories I had heard about strange beings, those that Peter mentioned in his conversation, didn't seem to have a clear foundation. Nobody knew anything for certain. I decided to return to the forest. I was no longer afraid. Well, at least not the irrational fear that had dominated me at first. Now, I was more determined than ever to get answers, even though those answers might be even more disconcerting. I returned alone, without talking to anyone about my plans, determined to discover if there really was something out there following my steps. Again, I found myself in the same forest, but this time I felt it was different. The air seemed heavier, as if everything was denser. The first day passed without incidents. I walked on the trail without finding anything out of the ordinary. The tracks were already an old memory, a stain that my mind had fallen into again and again. However, on the third day, while resting near a creek, I heard a noise. It wasn't the crackling of leaves or the wind among the pines. It was a distant but clear voice calling my name. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that my nerves were playing a trick on me, but then I heard it again. "Michael," whispered, soft, almost as if someone was waiting for me to respond. I got up immediately, taking the machete with my right hand, my heart pounding hard in my chest. The sound came from among the trees, and I could see something moving in the distance. It wasn't an animal or a clear human figure. It was just a shadow moving with impressive speed. I tried to call to that figure to ask what it wanted, but the voice, the same one I had heard, told me I shouldn't follow. It was a warning. I turned around without thinking more and began to walk fast, without looking back. I don't know how much time I spent walking, or if I really managed to get lost in the forest, or if I simply decided to leave that place forever. What I do know is that when I came out again to the civilized world, the sensation of being followed disappeared. But the echo of that voice never left my mind. I never returned to that forest. And every time someone asks me why I left it all behind, the only thing I can tell them is that there are things one simply shouldn't try to understand. My name is Gabriel, and I'm a writer. I've always sought solitude for my projects, a space where quietude and calm allow me to immerse myself in the stories that grow in my mind. Last year, I decided to travel to northern Montana, to an isolated cabin in the heart of the wild nature around Glacier National Park. I wanted to escape the noise of the world and the constant pressure of daily life. I had rented a secluded refuge without access to social networks or nearby civilization. I was ready to face my internal demons and the desolate beauty of the frozen landscapes. The cabin, built with rustic wood and apparently solid, seemed perfect. I arrived on a Friday afternoon when the sun was already setting, painting the sky orange and violet. The cold was intense but bearable. I spent the first hours conditioning the place, checking provisions, and setting up my desk near the window, from where I could contemplate the vast expanse of forest covered with snow. The cabin didn't have electricity, just a couple of gas lamps and a stove that would keep the environment warm. The firewood was abundant, and I made sure everything was in order for the night. I didn't have a cell phone, and although I had let nearby people know I would be out of contact for a while, the solitude weighed on me less than I had imagined. Even so, I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the silence so deep that it seemed not to let even the wind enter. That first night was quiet, or at least that's what I believed at first. I finished my dinner with a soup I had brought and settled into a chair by the fire, ready to write a little before sleeping. But something in the atmosphere bothered me. I couldn't explain it, but the air was charged as if there was something waiting in the darkness. I ignored it and kept working. My mind sank into the texts I was writing, but suddenly a crack in the wooden wall took me out of my concentration. It wasn't a natural noise like the creaks of the house due to cold. It was a softer sound, almost whispering. The sound came from somewhere inside the cabin. At first I thought maybe some rodent or small animal had snuck in, and I didn't pay it more attention. However, as the night progressed, the noises became clearer, more disturbing. Something was moving inside the house, sliding between the shadows, approaching and moving away from the fireplace, as if it were watching me. It was a strange sensation, as if there was someone in the same room but out of my sight. I decided I should sleep, that there was nothing to worry about, but I couldn't. The hours stretched on, and the cold penetrated deeper, not only outside but in my chest. The gas lamp flickered, and the stove fire crackled with force, as if it were the last bonfire at the end of the world. And then, again, the sound, now clearer, a kind of scraping, as if something sharp was sliding over the wood. I got up quickly, trying to find the cause of that noise. I walked through the cabin, checking the walls and floor, but found nothing. I thought I must be exhausted and that my mind was playing a trick on me. I returned to the chair by the fire and forced myself to stay still. But before I could calm down, the sound returned, this time louder, as if something was scraping the ceiling beams. It wasn't an animal, it couldn't do that. That was deliberate. Something was playing with me. My nerves reached their limit. I ran to the door and opened it suddenly, hoping the cold air would clear my mind. The wind was blowing hard, covering the snow with an even thicker layer. I looked toward the horizon, searching for some light, some sign of life, but everything was dark and desolate. There was nothing but the vast whiteness, infinite and cruel. I closed the door forcefully. I decided to light the gas lamp to better illuminate the cabin and sat in front of the fireplace, breathing deeply. But the sound didn't stop. It got closer and closer, as if it were right behind me. I turned around suddenly, searching with my eyes for the cause of that discomfort that was enveloping me. The cabin seemed empty. There was no one else there. However, when I looked toward the farthest corner of the room, I realized that one of the chairs was slightly displaced, as if someone had sat down and then gotten up quickly. A chill ran through my body. I got up immediately and walked toward the chair. I checked it, but there was nothing. Everything was in its place. It was then that I heard a laugh, very low, almost a whisper, but so clear that it made me take a step back. There was no way I was imagining it. I looked around searching for some explanation, but there was nothing, only me and the cabin in the middle of the cold. I couldn't stay there any longer. I ran out, crossing the door and getting lost in the night, without a fixed course, but without stopping. The wind cut my face, and the snow quickly covered my tracks. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had heard, about what I had felt. Something or someone had been inside the cabin with me. I walked for hours until exhaustion forced me to stop. The darkness was total and the cold unbearable. I returned to the cabin at dawn, fearful of what I might find, but there everything seemed normal. The chair was in its place. The fireplace was out, the fire already dead. I decided to stay the rest of the day, but fear didn't abandon me. Something told me I wasn't alone. That night back in the cabin, the same sound repeated again. But this time I didn't get up to investigate. I didn't want to know what caused it. Somehow I knew I wasn't alone, and if someone or something was watching me, I couldn't do anything about it. That second night, fear had paralyzed me in a way I had never experienced before. I was completely alone, and although logical explanations spun in my head, like maybe the sound was the result of some animal stuck in the walls or some air current playing with the wood, something inside me said it wasn't so. The scraping, the laugh, even the strange movements I had noticed in the cabin couldn't be explained only by nature. I decided I wasn't going to go out again in the middle of darkness. I knew that if I stayed inside the cabin, although the sensation of being watched wouldn't leave me alone, at least I would be safe from the elements that with wind and snow became relentless. At dawn, however, I planned to return to town, even if it was to rest a little and clear my thoughts. That same night, I prepared to sleep as quickly as possible. I turned off the gas lamp, covered the window cracks with the blankets I had brought, and curled up under the covers. I didn't know if I was seeking some comfort or simply wanted time to pass faster. The wind blew stronger and stronger, and the cabin creaked as if it too was complaining about the cold. The idea that any noise could be a product of nature helped me stay a little calmer, but not much. The hours passed slowly. The fireplace, which still retained some heat, stopped crackling little by little, and the only thing heard was the furious wind outside. It was then that I heard a new sound, much clearer than the previous ones. This time it was like a muffled tapping coming from somewhere nearby, as if someone was gently knocking on the wall. It was irregular, as if it wasn't trying to make noise on purpose, but rather testing something, feeling around. I got up slowly, looking for some logic in that noise. I looked around without daring to move too quickly, but there was nothing visible. Maybe a tree was hitting against the cabin because of the wind, or a broken branch had come loose and was now dancing against the walls. I convinced myself that was it. Perhaps the cold was making the wooden structure expand and contract, causing those strange noises. But while my mind tried to rationalize the situation, the thing continued. And not only that, the sound began to approach. Now it seemed to come from the ceiling. A soft tapping followed by another, as if someone was walking slowly over the beams. With each step, my heart accelerated more. I sat on the bed, motionless, holding my breath. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. There was something else here. I decided to investigate. Anything that could be rational, I couldn't stay there lying down waiting for fear to consume me. The darkness seemed to wrap around the cabin, and each shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. I grabbed a flashlight, turned it on, and got up. Walking through the cabin, however, wasn't easy. My feet moved cautiously, as if the floor could give way at any moment. As I approached the place where the noises came from, my mind overflowed with possibilities. It could be a large rodent, a fox, or something stranger. I knew that at those latitudes, wildlife was harder than I could imagine, but something in those sounds told me it wasn't about that. I finally reached the main room, right under the ceiling that was emitting those noises. I looked up as if expecting to find something concrete, a crack, some sign that what was happening had an explanation. But what I saw froze my body. Next to one of the ceiling beams, right in the farthest corner, there was a dark stain, small but clear, as if something had been rubbing there against the wood. I tried to get closer. At that moment, the sound ceased. An absolute silence fell over the cabin. The wind, which until then had been hitting the windows with force, also stopped. It was as if the entire world had stopped moving. Then the silence was broken by a very low sound, barely audible, a whisper. And it was clear, direct, as if someone was speaking behind me. "What are you doing here?" whispered a voice I couldn't identify, but that froze my blood. It wasn't a man's or woman's voice, but something different, like a murmur coming from within the walls. My mind, completely overwhelmed, did the only thing it could do: run. It didn't matter what was happening. It didn't matter if what I felt was real or not. I shot out of the cabin, without looking back, without stopping to think about the cold that burned my skin and the snow that stuck to my boots. I ran until I lost my breath, passing over the snow layer among the trees that rose like dark shadows. I needed to get out now. I needed to find the town. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I reached the main road. I don't know how I managed it. My body was exhausted, but fear pushed me forward, as if something I couldn't see was chasing me. I took the first truck I saw passing by. Luckily, a driver stopped, and I asked him to take me back to town. That same night, after telling a couple of locals what had happened, the man who had given me the ride looked at me fixedly, as if he knew something I didn't. "The better cabin?" he asked me. "Yes, the same one," I responded almost without thinking. "Well," he said while starting the engine, "that cabin has a bad reputation. Nobody dares to stay there for long. The betters never returned from there, and the stories of what happened to them keep circulating." I looked at him in silence. After all, what I had heard that night wasn't just the wind or my imagination. I wasn't alone. And although I now found myself safe, the memory of that voice, of the stain on the ceiling, and of the sensation that something was watching me continued to torment me. Maybe the most terrifying thing of all is that I never knew if what happened was a product of my mind, or if there was something real behind those noises, something that remained there waiting. My name is Samuel, and I'm a geographer. I've always had an ambiguous relationship with nature. Its immensity, its quietude, and its rawness fascinate me, but it also scares me, as happens to every human being who faces the uncontrollable. This trip to northern Canada was no exception. I planned it for months. A solo hike through the tundras with the hope of studying changes in the ecosystem. I knew the climate would be harsh, but nothing prepared me for what occurred. The journey began routinely. I arrived at the small town of Churchill in northern Manitoba with the idea of venturing into the tundras to study the ice layers and plant growth patterns. I made sure to carry the necessary equipment: compass, maps, thermal clothing, and a tent suitable for the climate. During the first days, everything went according to plan. The freezing wind cut my face, and snow covered the landscape in a white mantle that seemed endless. But as I advanced, the horizon became increasingly solitary. There were no traces of life, no animals, no vegetation, only the deep silence of the tundra. As I progressed, something peculiar began to happen. At first it was small, almost imperceptible. A tree that wasn't where I remembered it on the map, a rock that seemed not to be there before. I thought maybe memory was playing a trick on me, or that the wind had moved some of the rocks. But as I continued my path, these small details began to multiply. The marks of my own steps were erased faster than should have been possible. Sometimes I looked back and noticed that the path I had traveled was no longer the same. The mountain peaks looked more distant, the rock formations had shifted, and the shadows cast by the mountains didn't match the sunlight. Something didn't add up. On the third day, when I decided to take a break and set up my camp, something really strange happened. I found myself with a small stream, one I didn't remember having seen on the map or in my previous notes. It wasn't large, barely a thread of water flowing between the stones, but its presence puzzled me. I approached the shore to drink some water, but when I bent my head down, a slight murmur reached me. I thought it was the wind or the current, but I couldn't stop hearing that kind of whisper, as if something was speaking to me from the depths of the stream. I shook my head, pushing aside those strange ideas that were beginning to form in my mind, and drank from the current. Not even 3 minutes passed when I got up, and something changed in my perception of the environment. The shadows of the mountains looked different, as if something didn't fit, as if the peaks that before looked sharp were covered by a strange mist. I decided to continue forward. That night, while I settled into the tent, I felt a strange restlessness, but I couldn't define what it was. When I got into my sleeping bag, the solitude of the place felt even stronger, like pressure in the air. In the stillness of the tundra, something seemed to be watching me. It wasn't a rational fear. I couldn't say what exactly caused it, but it was there, a sensation that something wasn't right. The next day, something changed alarmingly. While advancing through a narrow pass between mountains, something on my route disappeared. I remembered having marked a clear path of stones, but when turning a corner, it was no longer there. I approached to check the area, and although I couldn't understand how, the stones seemed to have been replaced by compact snow. The wind blew forcefully, covering the terrain at an impossible speed for my pace. I crouched down examining the ground, but I couldn't find signs of my previous passage. I felt a knot in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I stayed silent for a few minutes listening, waiting for the wind to bring me some signal, but there was nothing. I decided to continue forward. I thought maybe the snow had accumulated too quickly, or that the climate was playing a trick on me. But as I walked, more and more, I realized that something was beginning to take me away from the route I knew. As the hours passed, the landscape began to become unrecognizable. I could no longer identify the rocks I had noted on my map. The mountains curved in strange ways, as if geography itself was changing before my eyes. The sun no longer set on the horizon as it should, but seemed to slip through a thin layer of clouds, creating diffuse shadows. I began to doubt my orientation, but the strangest thing happened when, advancing through a narrow pass between two large blocks of ice, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A strange bulge on the ground. At first I thought it was a stone, but as I approached I realized it wasn't a stone. It was something. It had a human shape, but its skin seemed an opaque white, almost translucent, and its figure faded as I approached, as if it were being absorbed by the snow. The air became denser, as if an invisible mist was surrounding me. I tried to touch it, but when I extended my hand, the figure disappeared completely. My heart beat hard, but fear wasn't something that could leave me paralyzed. I knew I couldn't lose my head, so I tried to advance. But with each step I felt as if the tundra was absorbing me, as if the terrain itself was taking me away from the route, from the map, from logic. At the end of the day, my situation was desperate. I had walked for hours without finding a single reference point that would allow me to return to the original path. The snow and wind had completely disoriented me. I could no longer trust my notes, nor the compass, nor my own judgment. The tundra had become an endless labyrinth. I decided to seek shelter to spend the night in a rocky crevice, but while preparing my camp, I looked back and saw something terrifying. My own trail was disappearing as I observed it. The snow covered my tracks with such frightening speed that I couldn't even distinguish where I had passed. The tundra seemed to devour me, strip me of my passage, of my trace. That night, although exhausted, I couldn't sleep. The sensation of being completely lost in a place I no longer recognized kept me awake. Something had changed in the tundra. Something I couldn't understand. Was it the climate? Was it the mind playing tricks? I didn't know, but something inside me told me I was no longer alone in that vast white desert. The next morning, when I finally decided to try to return, I noticed something that froze my blood. The way back no longer existed. The mountains, the rocks, the stream, everything had disappeared. The landscape was now a homogeneous mass of snow and wind. And although I looked at the horizon, there was nothing to guide me. The tundra had completely engulfed me. The wind blew with inhuman force, cutting my face with the coldness of thousands of needles. My thoughts began to become disordered. My mind became increasingly erratic as I walked without a fixed course. I knew I had to find a way to return, that if I didn't do it soon, the chances of surviving would be minimal. But everything that surrounded me seemed like a distorted reflection of what I had known. I looked at my compass once more as a mechanical act, although I no longer had hope that it could help me. The needle spun erratically, jumping from one side to another without establishing a clear direction. The map I had drawn in my notebook became useless. The symbols, the route marks, nothing told me anything in that empty landscape. I felt as if the entire world was changing around it, leaving me out of place, out of time. I decided to keep walking. I had no other choice. Each step sank me deeper into the snow, and my legs became heavier and heavier. But then, in the middle of that desolation, something began to stand out on the horizon. It wasn't an object or a structure, but rather a distortion in the snow, a subtle change in the terrain's texture. A shadow was approaching, something that shouldn't be there. I thought it was a mirage, some optical illusion caused by fatigue and cold, but the figure didn't disappear. On the contrary, as I advanced it became clearer. It was a kind of structure, something that seemed human, a kind of post, as if someone had left a mark in the middle of the tundra. This confused me even more. There was no indication of life in the area. Churchill was many kilometers to the south, and here there couldn't be anything. The image presented to me was of something irregular, twisted, covered by a layer of ice and snow, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. My heart began to beat faster. As I approached, I saw it wasn't a post, but a human being, but something completely strange. It was standing motionless, as if frozen in time. Its face was indescribable, covered by a thick layer of ice, and its clothing seemed to be made of a mixture of skin and fabric, but worn and torn, almost unrecognizable. My mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but I couldn't. Everything in me said I should move away, that something was wrong, but an inexplicable force pushed me to approach. The man, if it was a man, didn't move. There was no breathing, no signs of life. At first I thought it could be a figure of some lost explorer, someone who had been trapped by cold and snow. But looking more closely, I realized that his presence didn't make sense. There were no tracks around him, no trace of his passage, as if he had been there for years without leaving any mark on the terrain. I felt growing pressure in my chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. The sensation of isolation was deeper now than ever. I was completely alone on infinite and cold land, surrounded by something I didn't understand, something that defied any logical explanation. I decided to retreat, but before taking a step back, I heard a sound, a soft but clear whisper, as if someone was murmuring in my ear. "Return," said the voice so weak I barely heard it among the wind. "Return before it's too late." Panic invaded me immediately. I turned and looked back, searching for some sign of security, something familiar, something that would tell me I could still escape. But all I saw was more snow and more ice. There was no clue to orient me. The place had stopped being known, being accessible. I was trapped in a place I didn't understand, and worse still, in a place that didn't want me there. Suddenly, a gust of wind stronger than the previous ones pushed me backward, and involuntarily I fell to the ground. The snow quickly covered me, as if the ground itself wanted to bury me. With difficulty, I got up and tried to stand, but I noticed something was different. The figure I had seen before had disappeared. There was no trace of it, no tracks or marks, as if it had never existed. The wind continued blowing mercilessly, erasing everything in its path. I felt disoriented, vulnerable, and the cold began to penetrate my bones. The hours seemed to dilate as I walked aimlessly, desperation taking hold of me. Every time I stopped to rest, it seemed the landscape changed more and more, as if the terrain was being modified in real time. The mountains slowly faded in the distance. Shadows lengthened without reason, and the mist thickened with each step I took. I began to hear strange noises, as if someone was walking behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Sometimes I felt the presence of something near, watching me, waiting, but I was always alone, or at least that's what I thought. The murmurs continued, although I couldn't understand what they said. Sometimes they seemed to be words, other times just unintelligible sounds. Fear had begun to take hold of my mind, but what terrified me most was the sensation that my body wasn't reacting as it used to. I was exhausted, my legs trembled, and my breathing became more difficult with each step. I had moved too far from the security I once knew, and the tundra seemed to claim me, take me for itself. I felt that everything around me was swallowing me little by little. In that state of desperation, a thought assaulted me. What if I never get out of here? What if all this is a kind of trap, an invisible net that closes over me? Something inside me began to scream that I should run, that I should try to escape before it was too late. However, I didn't know where to go. The tundra continued being a labyrinth without exit, and I, a simple human being in the middle of it, completely defenseless. Finally, after what seemed like days but could have been just a few hours, I saw something on the horizon. It was a faint glow, almost imperceptible, but the mere fact of seeing it gave me some hope. I walked toward there with the last reserve of energy I had left. Each step was an effort, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let myself be defeated. As I approached, the glow became clearer. It wasn't the sun, it wasn't a natural light. It was a yellowish light, warm like that of a bonfire. But when I reached where I thought the source was, I found something even more disconcerting. There was no fire, no heat, just a small wooden structure completely worn down, as if it had been there for centuries. However, inside there was something that should never have been there. A lit fire, bright, alive, and over the fire, a figure. It wasn't human, but I couldn't describe it completely either. It had a presence, a force that made me stop dead. It was then that I knew there was no turning back. My name is Stephen Valdez. I'm a fisherman, although that's not the reason I'm telling you what happened in northern Wisconsin. What I want to tell you isn't a common story, nor does it have anything about adventure or bravery. On the contrary, it's a tale of survival, of how fear can become so real that it seems to take shape. The reason I'm coming to tell you this is because there's something that won't let me sleep, something I can't explain. And although I don't promise you answers, at least maybe I can release a little of the tension I feel when remembering what occurred. I traveled to Wisconsin a few years ago in search of tranquility and an opportunity to fish in its cold waters. It wasn't the first time I had traveled to the north. I've been to several places where winter seems to want to devour the earth. But this time, there was something different in the air, something beyond the cold that felt down to the bones. My plan was simple: fish in Lake Peshtigo, a body of water set apart in the mountains of the region. Snow fell in torrents during those months, and temperatures were so extreme that only the most experienced fishermen ventured to its waters. They said the lake was full of large trout, a good place for a catch that would remain in memory. For my part, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to clear my mind. The path to the lake was long, crossing forests of pines that rose like giant shadows, covered by thick layers of snow. On the way, I only saw some cars from people who were also looking to escape the noise of the city. But it was evident that place didn't receive many visits. It was a wild region where nature dictated the rules and men became insignificant before its power. When I arrived, the landscape was impressive, but also intimidating. The lake was frozen, and the ice layer was so thick that it gave the sensation of walking on solid ground. I parked my truck near the shore, took my fishing equipment, and began to make the hole in the ice. The cutting wind hit my face, and the silence was absolute, as if the entire world had stopped. Several hours passed. The daylight began to fade when I managed to catch my first fish, a large specimen with brilliant scales that fought hard before surrendering. I was happy, but something in the air disturbed me. The atmosphere, the sensation of being so isolated, made me think that not everything was right. Sometimes instinct tells me I should pay attention. And that afternoon was one of those moments. I decided it was time to return to camp. Although the freezing wind blew with more force, something obligated me not to leave so quickly. It was then that I heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, as if someone was walking on the ice. I looked in all directions but saw nothing. The sun had already set, and darkness began to cover everything. But the sound persisted, and although I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, something inside me told me it wasn't. I left the fishing equipment and approached the edge of the lake, trying to distinguish something in the blackness. Nothing. I decided I'd had enough for today. I collected my things and headed to camp. While doing so, I couldn't stop feeling that I wasn't alone. With each step, my mind created images of shadows moving in the periphery. But when I turned my head, everything seemed to be in its place. It was a psychological game, I knew it, but the sensations continued tormenting me. When I reached camp, the fire was almost out, and the wooden and mud cabin seemed more welcoming than ever. I prepared hot soup, settled in, and tried to rest. The night was deep, and the stars shone with an intensity only seen in those solitary corners of the world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. At midnight, I was awakened by a strange noise, a tapping on the door. It wasn't the wind or the sound of trees swaying. It was as if something was touching the wood softly, as if asking me to open. My heart beat hard, and fear began to take hold of me. I didn't dare get up. I didn't want to see what was there if there was something. I was sure it must be a creature or some animal that for some reason was approaching too much. But deep in my being, something told me it wasn't what was stalking me. The tapping ceased after a few minutes, but the sensation of presence persisted. I couldn't sleep all night. The next morning, the day was cloudy, and a light mist covered the lake. However, I had no intention of staying longer. I packed everything and headed toward my truck. But when I looked out the window, I saw it. A figure in the distance walking slowly along the shore of the lake, right where the ice began to break. It was a tall silhouette with a dark coat that blended with the mist, and although it seemed human, something in its posture wasn't. It walked with a slowness that was strange, as if it was dragging itself over the ice, but without making any noise. Trying not to lose sight of it, I decided the best thing was to abandon the place as quickly as possible. But before starting the engine, I heard a scream, a heartbreaking, long scream that came from the lake, as if someone was trapped under the ice. My first impulse was to return, try to help, but something inside me, a visceral fear I couldn't explain, stopped me. I knew that if I returned, it wouldn't be a rescue I would find. I started the truck and left as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I never knew who that figure was or where the scream came from. In the following days, I tried to look for information in nearby towns, but no one seemed to know anything. Some even looked at me with distrust, as if I had touched a subject I shouldn't have. Today, every time I think about that day, I feel that what was stalking me didn't come from nature. It wasn't an animal, nor the extreme cold, nor even a strange accident. There was something else in those frozen waters, something I maybe shouldn't have seen. And now, much time later, I don't even dare to ask. Days passed since I moved away from Peshtigo, but the memory of that didn't stop following me. When I returned to my home, the first thing I did was get rid of the fishing equipment and avoid any mention of the trip. The memories remained alive, like echoes in my head, and it didn't matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they always returned. What disturbed me most, however, wasn't the figure on the shore or the distant scream. It was the sensation that something had been left behind, something that couldn't be left behind simply by returning home. Although I tried, the image of that solitary being walking on the ice didn't fade. The memory of that face in the mist seemed to stay with me, trapping me like an anchor in the middle of the sea. For weeks I tried to convince myself that everything had been a product of solitude, of extreme cold and the tension of isolation. It's easy to rationalize fear when you're in a place so remote where the limits of human and natural mix. But the truth is there was something in that image, something that disturbed me beyond what I could understand. My mind began to create theories, but none seemed real enough to fit with what I had experienced. At first, I tried to continue with my life, keep fishing in the same places near my home, but something had changed in me. I no longer felt the peace that waters used to offer me. The reflection of water was no longer simply a mirror of nature. Now it seemed more like a door, a link to something dark, to a presence I couldn't understand. One day, while chatting with a friend about the trip, I mentioned the scream I heard at the lake. I thought he, being an experienced fisherman, could explain to me somehow what happened, but his reaction left me frozen. "A scream, you say?" he asked me, frowning. "That doesn't sound good. Are you sure it was a scream?" "Yes, of course," I responded, somewhat bewildered. "I heard it perfectly, as if someone was trapped under the ice. It was something anguishing." He remained silent for a moment, looking at the ground, and then looked at me with unusual seriousness. "Stephen, listen. That's not something you can ignore. There are stories about the lake, legends that no one ever mentions, but that are whispered in nearby towns. Lake Peshtigo isn't a common place. It has a dark history, and no, I'm not talking about something supernatural. There are more human things that live there." At that moment, a knot formed in my stomach. My friend wasn't one of those who talked about superstitions or strange things. There was something in his tone that made me feel uncomfortable. "What do you mean by that?" I asked him, unable to avoid it. "What happened to you isn't rare in those places. Many times when fishermen get trapped, when cold takes hold of them, they can no longer differentiate between what's real and what's not. Some get lost, others disappear, but few talk about it. There's something in that lake, something that hides, something you shouldn't have seen." And if you saw it, well, let's say it's not the first time it happens." I looked at him in silence, trying to assimilate his words. However, I didn't know what to think. How could I believe something so absurd? It was possible I was so affected by solitude and fear that my mind had played a trick on me. But what he said made me investigate. During the following days, I tried to talk to more people about Lake Peshtigo, and the answers I obtained were disturbing. In nearby towns, people were reluctant to talk about the lake, and if it was mentioned to them, many changed the subject quickly, as if they didn't want to touch something that should remain in oblivion. Finally, I found an older man in a small cafe, a robust guy with skin weathered by cold, who accepted to tell me what he knew. He had lived his entire life in that area, and his family had been part of the region for generations. "Lake Peshtigo," he said, wrinkling his face as if the simple mention of the name caused him discomfort. "I don't know if you believe in old men's stories, but I'll tell you what I know. The water of that lake is cold, colder than any other you've touched. And it's not just the ice that makes it dangerous. There's something in the depths. My grandfather always said that fishermen who stayed too long, who went too deep into its waters, never returned. Some disappeared, others simply lost their minds." I looked at him without knowing what to say, and he continued. "They say the ice isn't just ice, that the lake keeps what's below, something about which no one talks. If you ever feel something watching you or that wind follows you, don't ignore those sensations, friend. The lake doesn't forgive." The words of that man did nothing but submerge me in a sea of uncertainty. Although there was no proof, that sensation that what I had experienced didn't have a logical explanation kept growing inside me. I remember that one night, while I was at home, I couldn't avoid the temptation to review the old recordings I had made during my trip. I listened to the noises I had recorded near the lake. First the sound of wind, then the tapping on the cabin door, and finally something I hadn't noticed before. A very slight murmur, almost inaudible at first, but that grew as seconds passed. It seemed to come from the bottom of the water. The recording didn't capture it clearly, but the sound repeated, a kind of drowned whisper that I couldn't explain. Was that what I had heard that night? That presence I couldn't see, but knew was there. All I know is I never set foot near Lake Peshtigo again. Although the sensation of unease never left completely, I decided to leave behind everything I had experienced, but I don't forget. And although sometimes I wonder if everything was a product of solitude or fear, the sensation that something darker inhabits that place, something that isn't natural, persists. My life continued, but Lake Peshtigo never stopped wandering my mind. And every time I see frozen water, every time I hear the deep silence of winter, a part of me wonders if I'll ever know what hides in its depths. My name is Sebastian, and 2 years ago I made the decision to take a long road trip. I had heard stories about the wild beauty of northern Montana, about its endless landscapes, snow-covered mountains, and valleys that seemed taken from another world. I'm not one of those who fear solitude, and I've always had a special relationship with long trips where there's no hurry, where the road is the only companion. At the end of November, I decided to undertake my journey. I took my pickup truck, loaded everything necessary for a few weeks of adventure, and launched myself onto the route. The trip was quite calm until I reached one of the most remote highways in Montana. It was a cold afternoon. The sky was covered with gray clouds that foretold a storm. Snow was already beginning to fall in small particles flying through the air, creating a kind of white curtain that made visibility difficult. I had been driving for hours, and the cold was beginning to penetrate my bones despite the heating. At that hour, gas stations and small towns were far away, and only kilometers of empty highway remained. In an instant and without warning, the truck began to make strange noises. First, a low buzz that transformed into repeated knocking. I stopped the vehicle and got out to see what was happening. Snow covered everything around me, wind blew hard, and the sound of nature enveloped me. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong, but when I looked under the hood, I noticed the engine had begun to overheat. It wasn't a good sign. I tried to start the truck again, but there was no response. The battery no longer reacted. Desperation began to invade me. I didn't know how much longer I could wait in the middle of that nowhere. At least the heating continued working, but that didn't guarantee anything. I had no signal on my phone, and the chances that someone would pass through that area were minimal. I decided to try walking in search of some type of help, but wind cut my face and snow began to accumulate rapidly on the ground. The last thing I wanted was to be trapped there, lost in the cold desolation of Montana. Suddenly, I heard an engine. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but then I saw the lights of a truck approaching. My heart gave a small jump of relief. It was the opportunity I had been waiting for. The truck approached slowly, and as soon as it saw me, it stopped. The driver rolled down the window. He was a tall man with a thick beard that barely let his face show. His skin was weathered by wind, and his eyes, although dark, shone with a strange intensity. "Everything all right?" he asked with a raspy voice, almost as if he had gone hours without speaking. "My truck broke down," I responded, pointing to my vehicle. "Could you help me?" The man observed my truck for a few seconds and then nodded slowly. "I'm Frank. I can take you to the next town. It's a few hours away. You getting in?" At first I hesitated. Something in his tone of voice seemed strange to me, but the need for help overcame any unease I might have. The road was empty, and it was late. I had no options. "Thanks, I'd love to," I responded with a forced smile. When I got into the truck, I noticed the interior was warm and dry compared to the freezing I had left outside. The smell of gasoline and old leather filled my nostrils. Frank didn't say anything more for several minutes. The radio was off, and only the engine's roar could be heard, accompanied by snow hitting the truck. As we advanced down the highway, I began to feel uncomfortable. Frank drove slowly and precisely, but his movements were disturbing. From time to time, he threw quick glances at me, as if evaluating me, but he didn't say a word. The landscape seemed endless, snow-covered mountains and the dark sky that foretold more storm. Finally, after a long silence, Frank broke the stillness. "What brings you to these parts?" he asked, but he did it in a way that made me think he already knew. It wasn't a casual question. "Just exploring," I responded uncomfortably. I wanted to see Montana, its landscapes, be in contact with nature. Frank nodded, but he didn't seem very interested in my answer. Instead, he observed me with growing intensity. The night's darkness seemed to envelop us more, and the truck advanced slowly down the highway. Something in his presence made me nervous, but I couldn't pinpoint what. At one point, Frank began to talk about his trips. He told stories about how he had traveled the entire region, carrying heavy loads from one place to another. But suddenly, his stories became increasingly strange. He talked about people he had met on the road, but described them with a somewhat macabre tone, as if there was something dark in each encounter. There was something disturbing in his way of telling things. Suddenly, he asked me, "Did you know that sometimes people disappear on these highways? Snow is so treacherous that some don't even know what happened to them until it's too late." That froze my blood. I didn't respond immediately. I looked out the window trying to maintain calm, but my stomach churned. Wind hit hard against the windows, and the truck continued its march without hurry, while Frank didn't stop observing me from time to time with that penetrating gaze. Silence fell over us again, and on a couple of occasions, I had the sensation that the truck was slowing down for no apparent reason. I noticed it by the slight sound the engine made when reducing revolutions. Why was he doing that? I wondered if Frank was really taking me toward town or if he had another plan in mind. Every time I looked at the clock, hours seemed to stagnate. Finally, when I could no longer bear the discomfort, I decided to ask Frank if we were close to town. "Almost there," he responded without looking at me, and his tone was strange, so empty, so distant, as if what he was saying had no meaning. It was at that moment that I saw it. In the middle of darkness, in the distance, a weak glow appeared on the highway. It wasn't a normal light. It was something too dim, as if it were a flame that vacillated. Something wasn't right. Frank began to reduce speed, and my heart began to beat hard. "What's that?" I asked, trying not to sound scared. Frank didn't answer immediately. His face became even more expressionless, and instead of braking, he accelerated. "It's just the town," he said without looking toward where I was pointing. When we got closer, the light disappeared. There was nothing left, only snow and the deserted highway. My mind began to overflow with doubts. Was there no town? Why didn't Frank react? Finally, when I thought I could no longer bear it, the truck braked suddenly. He looked at me fixedly. "There's no town. This is the end of the trip," he said, and a twisted smile appeared on his face. Cold took hold of me again. I knew I was trapped in the middle of nowhere. The truck stopped and the engine ceased suddenly. "I'm sorry, Sebastian. Nobody leaves here," he murmured. Darkness closed around us like an iron lid. Absolute silence enveloped me. At that moment, I knew the real journey was just beginning. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.